The Ruthless Alpha. Home Audiobook. Welcome to the Ruthless Alpha audiobook series. In this first chapter, we are introduced to Kor, the fearsome leader of a ruthless pack. His strength and cunning have earned him his position as the Alpha, but as enemies rise and loyalties shift, Kor must decide whether his brutal approach to leadership will be his salvation or his downfall. In this episode, dive deep into Kor's world of power, betrayal, and survival, where the line between leader and tyrant is razor thin. Will Kor's quest for dominance lead to greatness, or will his ruthless nature ultimately cost him everything he holds dear? Listen to the full chapter now and experience the world of the Ruthless Alpha like never before. Headphone, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more chapters and exclusive content from the Ruthless Alpha audiobook series. Flop's Joy was pointing at Maddox Mad Dog Killingworth, who was standing near the park benches on the far end of the town square with half a dozen members of his pack. Katrina felt a flutter of nervousness run through her. Yesterday Maddox, the alpha of the Killingworth pack, had issued an edict saying that the Morehouse pack was no longer allowed to visit Greenville ever. They were banned. Apparently her stepfather's nephews had gotten into some kind of argument the last time they'd come to town, and because of that Maddox had felt he had the right to actually ban her pack from town forever, except that was crap. Greenville had always been shared by both packs. It was the only shifter town within 200 miles, and shifters tended to avoid human towns whenever possible. There was always the risk of exposure. Sure, the Morehouse pack had enough resources on their land to live off of forever, but that wasn't the point. They didn't have grocery stores, clothing stores, coffee shops, movie theaters, bookstores, gift shops, all the things that made life worth living. She'd been waiting for her stepfather Roman Kaufman to issue a death challenge since the moment they'd been told of the ban. She wasn't surprised he hadn't even addressed the issue with the pack yet. That kind of ban was a direct insult to Roman and his authority. The Killingworth pack and her stepfather's pack had been clashing more and more ever since her stepfather took over. Property line disputes, fist fights and bar fights, accusations of her PAC's alleged misbehavior in town, which Roman had explained were just excuses and lies intended to discredit them. She looked across the square. How would she feel if her stepfather killed Maddox? A death match seemed inevitable, if not over the ban then over something else, and soon Roman couldn't continue allowing Maddox to challenge his authority. She'd known Maddox since high school, although because of their pack rivalry she'd always avoided him and admired from afar. He'd been the hot guy that all the girls swooned over. The sure bet to take over the Killingworth pack after his father passed away, and so he had. Unfortunately, he was turning out to be a bully, trying to assert his dominance and hem her pack in at every turn. Who would win? Maddox was the only alpha she knew of who might actually have a chance against her stepfather. So far both her stepfather and Maddox were undefeated in every death challenge they'd taken place in. It would be a close contest. Her mind flashed back to the death challenge that Roman had issued to her own father 3 years earlier. He'd won that like he'd won all of his other challenges. She mourned her father's death and personally couldn't stand Roman, but she'd been forced to accept him as the pack's new leader. That was the way of life for shifters. Her own mother hadn't just accepted him, she'd accepted his offer of marriage. I bet they came to town today to make sure none of us come here, and I really wanted some new shoes. Joy gazed longingly at the such a heel shop across the square. To get there they'd have to pass right by Maddox's pack, which would probably be a bad idea. They have a sale. Her lower lip Jutted out, my stepfather will put a stop to this soon enough, Katrina said, scowling. So Roman definitely didn't say we're not allowed to be here, right? Joy sounded anxious, which was understandable. Nobody wanted to be seen as disobeying their alpha. I would have told you he hasn't said anything yet. Maybe coming into town hadn't been the best idea, but Maddox's ridiculous order had sparked her rebellious nature, the nature that her mother continually despaired of because she wanted Katrina to behave like a proper lady and a perfect potential mate for an alpha. Well, the hell with that. She'd been born with her daddy's stubborn streak, the streak which had led him to accept a death challenge that he knew he couldn't win. Maybe that wasn't the best example at a time like this. Screw it, I'm here to shop. The Killingworth pack didn't even say what would happen if we came into town and we're female. What would they possibly do to us? I'm not sure. I want to find out, Joy said nervously. She looked across the street at Maddox. He was yelling at a coyote shifter, Elroy from the Brown pack. Elroy Brown was cringing submissively, and he ran over and picked up an empty beer can which he just tossed on the sidewalk and then hurried over and tossed it into a garbage can. Maddox strolled over and cuffed the coyote on the head so hard it sent him reeling. He yelled something at Elroy and pointed. Elroy turned and ran in the direction that Maddox had pointed, his shoulders hunched, his head hanging. If he'd been in coyote form, his tail would have been tucked between his legs. What a jerk, Katrina growled. I know, right? Joy made a tisking noise of disapproval. I hate those Browns. They vandalized my friend's car last month. No, I mean Maddox, of course. Yeah, the Brown family were petty criminals and notorious douchebags, but right now she was royally pissed off at Maddox, so everything he did was by definition wrong. Speaking of his holy hotness, we should get out of here before he sees us. Joy opened her car door. Don't call him hot, Katrina grumbled. I think that might be pack treason, and again, we're girls. What's the worst that could happen if he sees us? A sudden and ridiculous image flashed through her mind. It was an image of Maddox punishing her by throwing her over his knee, flipping up her skirt and spanking her bare bottom with his large hands, smacking down on her bare flesh again and again. Why was her butt bare in this vision? Why was she squirming and moaning? She felt heat rising to her cheeks. Damn it, sometimes when she thought about Maddox, the most ridiculous and random images popped into her mind, and oddly enough she was always missing some clothing in those images, and Maddox was doing things to her. Over the years she'd seen Maddox glance her way with a certain gleam in his eyes, but he'd never attempted to talk to her. Aside from a few brusque exchanges in high school, she suspected he looked at every female of mating age the same way. You can go if you want. I'm not going anywhere, she said stubbornly. I'm headed back. Then what if Roman asks where you are? Tell him. Katrina shrugged. Because Roman was married to her mother, she got away with a lot, and she had to admit she tended to push it. She was never openly disrespectful to him, of course, but she pretty much did what she wanted and went where she wanted without asking permission. She was the only one who got away with it. Roman had clamped down on everyone in the pack after he'd taken over, wanting to know their whereabouts at all times. Half the pack lands were now off limits to everybody since he was putting up new buildings there. He was definitely a control freak, and she knew not everybody in the pack was happy with his leadership. They could have chosen to leave the pack. New rules by the Council of Elders had made that much easier, but their only other local option was the Killingworth pack, and the rivalry between those two packs had gone back for generations. A few of the pack members had actually gone over to the Killingworth pack, which spoke to the level of their dissatisfaction, but most of them were just grumbling under their breath and sucking it up. Peace out, Joy said. I'm getting out while the getting's good. See you when you get home. She slid into her car and drove off, leaving Katrina standing there. She bit her lip. The defiant nature in her wanted to saunter past Maddox and his crew and go shop wherever the hell she wanted. However, even she had to admit that issuing such a blatant challenge to a hot-headed bully like Maddox probably wasn't a great idea. Well, at least she could grab a cup of coffee and debate her next move. Maybe when she came out the Killingworth pack would be gone. Katrina felt a rising uneasiness as she walked into the Beanbag, her favorite coffee shop. Everyone stopped talking and turned to stare at her. The waitresses, the customers, the clerk at the counter. The hostility clouded the air like a fog. Katrina was a sensitive, a mutation which among other things caused her to pick up on the strong emotions of those who were physically close to her. She hardly needed her psychic powers today, though it was all right there in the lowered eyes and stiff backs of the shifters she was walking past. As Katrina threaded her way between the tables, the customers fell silent and looked away, pretending to be very interested in something invisible just outside the coffee shop's picture window, so that they'd all heard. Lovely. Everybody in town had been happy enough to accept her stepfather's very generous donations of a new town library and the other charitable organizations he donated to over the past couple of years, the senior shifters respite center, the new high school stadium. So why were they so eager to turn on him now? She walked up to the counter, feeling the gazes of a dozen shifters burning into her. "I'd like a cinnamon latte," she said to Paige, the coyote shifter who was behind the counter, to go. Suddenly she didn't feel like hanging out in town anymore. She drank her latte as she drove back home. "I'm sorry, Katrina, I can't," Paige said with an apologetic wince. "Maddox's orders." "Excuse me, you won't even sell me a cup of coffee?" Paige shook her head. This was unbelievable. She'd been shopping in this town since she was a child. How could Maddox have this much power? Weren't the merchants worried about the loss of business that they'd suffer? He must have them running scared to make this kind of sacrifice. "You're not even a member of his pack," Katrina protested, feeling anger and frustration welling up inside. "He offers us protection when we need it, and nobody wants to get on his bad side." Paige looked beyond Katrina at the person behind her. Next she called out as if Katrina wasn't there. Katrina turned and walked out of the store seething. She hesitated, considering her next move. She heard voices behind her and jumped, but it was just a group of gopher shifters. As they walked past her, she saw her friend Stacy Dawson from high school. There was a wolf shifter with them that she didn't recognize. "Hey Stacy," she called out. There was no way that Stacy didn't hear her, but everyone in the group ignored her and quickened their pace, almost breaking into a jog. Without even looking back, they rushed around the corner, tension radiating from their bodies. Good God, was Maddox even turning her friends against her? The Gophers lived on the property that bordered her pack's land. She'd gone to school with them, they'd gone to parties at each other's houses. Stacy had come to her Sweet 16. She hadn't seen much of any of the Gophers over the past year. She'd called Stacy a few times and never gotten a call back. She had thought that maybe it had something to do with her stepfather doing a lot of construction in the area that bordered his land. Maybe it had upset them somehow. Now she wondered if the real reason was that the Killingworth pack had threatened them. She was so furious at Maddox Killingworth right now that she was ready to spit. So of course, as she hurried back to her car, Maddox and several of his men stepped out from behind a van that was now parked right next to it. Maddox was tall, so tall she had to tip her head back to look at him. Like all alphas, he spent a lot of time at the gym. His white t-shirt perfectly molded to his muscular form. Tattoos adorned his right arm. She loved tattoos on a guy, any other guy than Maddox. Of course, he had a strong jaw with a hint of scruff on it and thick brown hair. He kept his hair close shaved on the sides. His dark brown eyes always held a glint of mischief in them. Carver Lawrence had of pack security was with him and several of Maddox's cousins and other packmates. Maddox walked up to her, blocking her path, and his gaze swept over her body from head to toe. It was a slow, blatant appraisal that made her whole body heat up. He lingered on her breasts a moment before sweeping upward, forcing unwanted visions of him sucking on her nipples. Her heart hammered against her rib cage and her mouth went dry. She swallowed hard but met his gaze with a challenging scowl, enjoying the view. She growled, "Of course, Mad." Smiled, "Always. Well, Maddox, I'd love to just stand here and bask in your glorious presence, but I've actually exceeded my recommended daily allowance of scumbag, if you'll excuse me." She tried to step around him and he moved to block her. "What's the rush? We never talk. How's your day going?" He grinned. She skewered him with a furious glare. "You know exactly how my day is going since you've poisoned everyone in town against us." Maddox let out a snort of contempt. "Did I do that, or did your stepfather do that? Has it occurred to you that the reason that everybody is so eager to enforce the ban is because they can't stand your pack now that your stepfather is in charge? No, it's because they're terrified of you." She spit the words out. He shook his head. "They asked us for help and we obliged. They don't want your pack in town anymore." He's trying to order the town's councilmen around, demanding that they change building laws just to suit him, threatening to kill the property appraiser for refusing to redraw the pack's property lines. "Your stepfather's nephews are the town bullies, starting fights, causing property damage, stealing and threatening to hurt anyone who reports them. I'm not even going to dignify those accusations with a response. Would Corey and Randy really do that?" Sure, they had hair-trigger tempers, but she turned to walk away. He wasn't going to let her get in her car. Fine, she'd call her pack and get someone to come pick her up. Carver stepped in front of her. She felt Maddox's hand close on her shoulder, squeezing hard. It sent an electric jolt through her body. She'd never actually touched him before. For just the briefest moment she had the temptation to reach up and cover his hand with her own, to lean back into him. She must be having a stroke or something. She tried to shrug his hand off, and when he wouldn't let go she spun around to face him. "Get your paws off of me." He shook his head. "Sorry, we issued an edict. You disobeyed and disrespected my pack. I can't let that slide." Her skin itched and fur briefly rippled over her face. Her claws shot out. She forced them to retract, struggling to stay in human form, and damn it, he just made her ruin her manicure, which she was adding to her list of reasons to hate him. "So what do you plan on doing about it?" "Giving me a beat down." She glared at him. If he tried, she'd shift and draw blood. Of course he'd totally kick her ass, but she didn't care. Maddox looked highly amused at that. "Me hit a lady, or you for that matter?" Katrina tried to slap him and he caught her wrist in a steely grip. "Only if she asks very nicely, and only under certain special circumstances. I've got a better idea." In one swift motion he grabbed her and slung her over his shoulder, and one of his packmates slapped a copper collar on her neck. Now she couldn't shift. Carver had opened the van's back door and Maddox had dumped her in there and slammed the door shut with a clanging sound. "You son of a," she shrieked, "you mongrel, your parents have fleas, you have a fake pedigree, I will kill you, I swear to God." The van started up and drove off. She was actually being kidnapped. Katrina Hager was being kidnapped. Damn it, to hell and back again. She was supposed to be helping one of her aunts with a catering job tomorrow, to say nothing of how her mother was going to react. She'd be furious about the embarrassment of the pack and blame it on Katrina. She clawed at the door. There was no lock on the inside. They drove for about 20 minutes. She tried without success to pull the collar off her neck. She screamed. She kicked the back door. She kicked the walls. Then she got tired of it and her feet started to hurt, so she sat down and imagined all the ways her pack was going to get revenge on Maddox and his Crew Maddox was going to get the death challenge to end all death challenges. Chapter 2 Maddox swung open the door to the room where they'd put Trina, and a heavy hardcover book went flying at his head. He caught it, walked in and shut the door behind him. He didn't bother to lock it. He knew she couldn't get past him. He glanced down at the book. "So you recommend James Rollins?" he said. "I haven't read him yet, but I'll give him a try when I have some free time." He set the book down on a small wooden table and sat down. Katrina was sitting on the bed, her shining hair rumpled, brown eyes blazing with rage. He still felt that sharp stab of longing deep inside, the one that he'd felt since the first time he'd seen her back in high school. It was like a strong magnetic pole. Katrina was the main reason he'd screwed around so much in high school and then college, always trying to sate a hunger that could never be satisfied. She was the reason he'd stayed single, hadn't bothered to claim a mate yet, despite everyone's urging it wouldn't be fair to whoever he met with until he banished this ridiculous fixation. The only thing that made sense was to stay single and keep his relationships brief and no strings attached. With Katrina being a member of the Morris pack, he'd never even tried to act on his attraction, and he wouldn't now. He was an alpha and his responsibility to his pack came first. Mating with the enemy never. In fact, when he'd seen her and Joy in town, he'd almost deeded pretending not to notice them and letting them both escape. Having her here so close to him would be incredibly distracting, so why had he ended up letting Joy go and just taking Katrina? Well, Katrina was the alpha stepdaughter, so that would make the biggest statement, or that's what he tried to tell himself anyway. She glowered at him and yanked at the copper collar. "Take this damn thing off of me. Here, let me help you with that." Maddox walked over, pulled the key out of his pocket and unlocked it. His fingers brushed against her warm velvety skin and he felt blood rush to his groin. Her scent was intoxicating. He could smell her musky arousal mixed with honeysuckle shampoo. He fought the urge to lean in and inhale deeply. Instead, he moved away from her quickly. She ripped the collar off and hurled it across the room. As Maddox walked back to his chair, he'd had Katrina placed in a room at the end of a wing off the pack's main house. The house was a sprawling 30-room structure where Maddox and many of the other single males of his pack lived. The room where they'd keep Katrina was sparely decorated and secure. There was a wooden framed bed, there was a table and chairs, there was a small bathroom with a cast iron tub and basic toiletries: toothbrush, shampoo and conditioner, soap, towels, toilet paper. He wasn't a complete savage after all. The windows had bars on the outside which could swing open in case of fire, but they were locked up tight. There was a bookshelf full of books and magazines, so she'd have something to do. He didn't expect her to sit there and stare at the four walls while she was there so comfortable. He gave a lazy smile, easily hiding his raging arousal. He was a master of stuffing his feelings down and putting on a poker face when he needed to. "You son of a!" Katrina let loose a stream of curses. He waited for her to finish. "It took several minutes." "I'm going to kill you," she shouted. "I'm going to rip your throat out. Based on your past performance, I tend to doubt it." "You're welcome to try." However, fur rippled across her face and her jaw lengthened. White fur, he noticed, as her ears sharpened to points and laid flat back against her skull. Black claws shot out from her fingertips and her fangs descended. She didn't shift fully, only her head. Probably didn't want to ruin her clothes. He didn't even bother to shift. She'd make a cute little wolf, one he could bat aside easily with one swipe of his paw if necessary. He just sat there and stared into her caramel brown eyes without blinking. After a minute she growled and shifted back to human form. "Now here's what's going to happen," he said calmly. "Your pack has been playing dirty with our pack's property lines. I assume that you know about their challenge to the Council of Elders." "What challenge?" She scowled. "They're trying to annex a large section of our property pulling some crap about how we falsified the property lines a century ago and our land belongs to your pack. They tried to appeal to the state council and were smacked down, so now they're taking it to the council of elders. Kind of a cowardly little move, whining to the council about something like that. I was surprised that Roman didn't just issue a challenge if he wanted to steal our land so badly. She let out a low rumbling growl at the insult to her pack's alpha. And this affects me how? She asked. Sullenly, keeping you here lets Roman know his place, which is beneath me. So what happens now? I send a message to Roman that you will be staying here until after we've resolved his property dispute, and if any male members of his pack set a paw in town, we'll kill them. Basically, there's no way that he won't issue a death challenge at this point. She folded her arms across her chest. Why don't you just challenge him if you're so eager for a fight? He shrugged. I'm never eager for a fight, Katrina. I just do what has to be done. I don't issue death challenges lightly because I always win. There's the possibility that your stepfather will regain his senses, back down, and start treating the people of Greenville with respect, and if you don't succeed in bullying him into submitting, which you won't, then pretty soon I'll be the one issuing the challenge. He's left me no choice. I say my condolences to your pack in advance. He just grinned at her. You're cute when you're mad. She curled her lip in scorn. You'll be cute when you're dead. Damn it, why did he keep provoking her? When he got more turned on, the feistier she got. He had a raging heart on, and it was all he could do to keep himself from pouncing on her. Yeah, that would go over real well, him molesting a hostage. He imagined his parents spinning in their graves at the mere thought. He stood up abruptly. He had to get out of here. He should have sent someone else in the first place. Something about Katrina seemed to fog his brain and steal his common sense. Someone will be by with dinner later. He'd have one of the other pack members bring all of her meals. It was hard to think when most of the blood in his body had left his brain. She stared at him, and he could see the bones in her face ripple as she forced her wolf down. One favor before you go. Her voice had gone sack and sweet. What? He grinned at her, bearing some fang. I my own throat out. I was just wondering if you'd mind shifting, she said in a saccharine sweet tone. I want to remember what color your pelt is to see if it'll match the decor in my room. Is that right? You want to rub yourself in my fur while you lie in front of your fireplace? He heard his voice go low and seductive. Damn it, he just done it again. He was an idiot. Why couldn't he stop himself from flirting with her? No, I want to step on your stuffed head every day on my way out the door. He burst out laughing at that. He had to say he admired her. She was strong, a definite alpha. He loved a woman who didn't take any crap. Although she was short a good 53 and maybe 130 pounds, there was something about the way she carried herself that said, mess with me and I'll chew your face off. He was about to walk out when the door flew open and he turned towards it with a growl. Nobody was supposed to be here. His 8-year-old niece Heather was standing there with a woe-begone look on her little face. He felt anger and frustration welling up inside him. Who had let her wander over to the side of the house, and why wasn't her father watching her? Because Bruce was still drowning in drink to dull the sorrow of the loss of his mate. That was why. Before he could growl at her to leave this part of the house at once, she announced loudly in a deeply wounded voice, nobody will French braid my hair. Everyone says they're busy. Tara and Emma have French braided hair and nobody will French braid my hair. Oh, that's easy, I'll do it, Katrina called out, and Heather ducked under his arm and ran over to her, beaming. Maddox could have easily stopped Heather, tucked her under his arm, carried her off, and sent her to sit in her room for the rest of the night for coming into an area of the house where she was forbidden to go with any of the other cubs. He would have. They needed to learn early on that the alpha's word was However, with Heather he tended to cut her some slack. She was basically a good kid, never openly rude or disrespectful. She lost her mother a year ago to a hunting accident, and now she'd pretty much lost her father too because of the drinking, which was going to need to be addressed sooner rather than later. He watched as Katrina knelt down next to Heather and skillfully braided her slim fingers, skipping over Heather's long blonde hair. She paused. Got a brush? She asked Maddox. There's a few knots in here, she said it politely with a smile. But Maddox picked up on the faintest hint of reproach in her voice. He glanced at Heather's hair and saw that there were more than a few knots in there, and he could see grime on the back of her neck. Katrina slid behind Heather so the little girl couldn't see his expression and shot him a look that had more steel in it than he'd seen in the eyes of alphas coming at him in the death arena. I know, he said to her unanswered question. Yes, it will be dealt with. He glanced at Heather, who was leaning into to Katrina. I'll be right back with that brush, he added, and headed out. He shut and locked the heavy door behind him. He knew Heather was perfect safe here with Katrina. If anything, he hoped she didn't latch onto her too much. Katrina wouldn't be staying, and the last thing that Heather needed was to get too close to someone who was going to disappear from her life again. He returned a few minutes later with the brush and a can of no-tangle spray that one of his cousins found for him, and sat there and watched as Katrina carefully detangled her hair. When she was done, he said sternly to Heather, you know I told you and all the other cubs to stay out of this end of the house. Her face fell and he caught Katrina giving him the stink eye. What does bully spell? She said, her tone sweet but her gaze sharp with annoyance at him. Too bad he was the alpha and his rules were made to be followed. Heather waved her hand frantically in the air. I know, I can spell it. Spells bully. Very good, I knew you were smart. You must be adopted. Heather looked puzzled. What's adopted? Maddox interrupted. Go find Aunt Caroline and tell her that I want you to spend the night at her house tonight. Okay, Heather sighed. Then she asked hopefully, can Katrina come with me? She's my friend. Katrina leaped in and gave him a graceful out. Oh, I wish I could, honey, but I have some work to do. What kind of work? I could stay in help. I'm a good helper. Heather shifted from one foot to another, twisting and untwisting her hands. Katrina favored her with a gentle smile. Oh, boring grown-up work, homework, experimental quantum mechanics with a physical application. Heather's little face screwed up like she just sucked a lemon. That sounds hard. I'm going to go find Aunt Caroline. She left the room. Experimental what? Maddox asked. I thought you worked for your PAX catering company. I do. Totally pulled that out of my butt. I figured it would send her running. That was nice of you, Maddox said. I'm always nice to cubs unless they need their butts swatted. She's a lovely cub. Surprised that she came from your pack. I'm sure you'll ruin her soon enough. He didn't bother to respond to the insult. He'd almost certainly be killing her stepfather sometime soon. That was response enough. Need anything while you're in here? A set of skinning knives. She gave him a fierce grin and let her fangs descend. Partway he found himself ridiculously turned on. Damn, what a feisty little fireball. If she'd been a member of any other pack but the Morris pack, well, his life would be very different. Nothing then. Hope you get lots of reading done. He turned and walked out of the door, shutting it behind him and sliding the massive deadbolt into place. He heard something thud against the door and suppressed a smile. He walked down the long hallway and through the doorway that into the main house. The floors were flagstone and the enormous living room had a huge fireplace and several groupings of leather sofas and chairs. Two-story floor-to-ceiling windows opened out to views of the dense green pine and fir forests that barred their lands and the looming Gore mountain range in the distance. The sky was the clear blue of the ocean and strings of white cotton clouds floated around the mountain sawtooth peaks. Maddox waved at several of his packmates who were playing a game of pool and headed towards the front door. He needed to find Bruce and put his paw down once and for all, stop drinking and take care of his daughter or he'd be out of the pack. It might sound harsh, but shifters lived a harsh life. Everyone had losses. You grieved them and honored your dead's memory by living an admirable life and contributing to your pack. You didn't drown yourself and drag your family under with you. As Maddox stepped outside, he scented Lula before he saw her and stifled a growl of impatience. Several months ago they'd had a few brief dalliances before they'd made it. He couldn't have been more clear about the fact that he had no interest in anything permanent. He found out quickly that she only heard what she wanted to hear, which was apparently imaginary voices in her head telling her he wanted to marry her. She was standing on the front porch wearing a cleavage plunging halter dress and sandals. She'd gone heavy on the perfume and makeup today. She'd clearly been standing there waiting for him. He kept walking without acknowledging her. She turned and scampered after him. Maddox, wait, sorry Lula, I'm busy. I thought you could take a little time off to relax. She quickened her stride to keep up with him. Lula, I've told you I'm not interested. Tact had gotten him nowhere. He'd have to be more forceful. She let out a tinkling laugh and put her hand on his arm. Now I know you're lying. I smell your arousal. He cursed silently and wondered if Katrina had scented it too. With a shrug he shook her off. It's not for you. Harsh but necessary. She broke into a trot, sniffing at the air, then stared at him. What do you mean it's not for me? Who is it for? I sent another woman on you. Who is it? Her voice rose in anger and dismay. He didn't answer, just gave a growl of impatience as he headed in the direction of Bruce's cabin. I don't know that scent. Oh my God, is it the hostage that Morris? Lula stared at him in astonishment. You can't be attracted to her. How could you? I'm right here. Yes, I see you. I'm not blind. Tears filled her eyes. You are, if you prefer her over me. I am absolutely perfect for you. I'd make an amazing alpha mate. I'm an alpha myself. After all, he restrained himself from saying what he thought, that she wasn't an al. She was a bully who backed down whenever she came up against real strength. Instead he stopped walking and leveled an ice-cold glower at her. We will not be mates. This has nothing to do with our hostage who will be returning to her pack shortly. You and I are not compatible, and this is the last time we're having this conversation. I can have you move to another part of pack property and ban you from the main house if I need to make my point any clear. He turned and left her, ignoring her yelp of outrage. Chapter 3. Katrina had no idea what time it was, but a glance through the window showed that the sun had risen and was bathing the forest outside in golden light. She paced the floor angrily. How long would she be confined here? What if all of this melodrama dragged on for weeks? Would she be kept in here like a prisoner in a jail cell? She wasn't used to sitting around doing nothing at home. She was a whirlwind, up early helping cook for the catering company, tending to her family's herb garden, heading into town to socialize and shop. Of course Maddox had ruined that for her. When she heard the lock on the door slide open, her heart did a strange leap in her chest. Maddox had come back. Well, good. She was looking forward to insulting his ancestry and questioning his manhood. Her heart fell when Carver walked through the door holding a dinner tray. The plate of pot roast and mashed potatoes smelled delicious, as did the hot apple pie, but she barely noticed it. Where's your boss? She said as he set the tray down on the table. Is he scared of little old me? Heck busy. Carver's tone was curt. She glanced at the door. Carver followed her gaze. Don't try it, he said, or try if you want. I run fast and this area of the house is very secure, as is our entire compound. Carver was a big muscular slab of man. There was no way she could get past him, and they both knew it well. Pass along a message to your flea bee boss. I expect to be able to walk around the Property during the day. I am not going to sit in this room 24 hours a day until Maddox gets his thumb out of his ass and decides to let me go. If those are your plans for me, I will chew someone's face off or die trying. Capic, and she meant it. If she had to stay confined here she'd go mad, or we could put the copper collar back on you and chain you to the bed. Carver looked bored. We don't let our hostages set the rules around here. Try it. She bristled with anger and clenched her fists. He just laughed and walked out of the room as she glowered furiously after him. What a dick. She thought he was even worse than Maddox. Annoyed, she sat down and dove into her dinner, which was delicious. Fine, so they had some halfway decent cooks here and they were feeding their prisoner well. She still hated all of them except for poor little Heather, who was obviously being neglected. She wished she could grab Heather and take her back home with her. About half an hour later Carver came back. She thought maybe Maddox would come, but he didn't. She felt a flare of irritation. Coward, she thought indignantly. Did you tell him? She snapped. You're well for bringing you dinner. By the way, did you tell him? Your manners are about what I'd expect from a member of the Morris pack. Yes, he said that starting tomorrow morning you can have a guard accompany you out around certain areas of the compound if you give us any crap. The copper collar is always an option. His gaze was cold. Who put a bug up your ass? She snapped. Your stepfather and his entire family and every member of the Morris pack for that matter. Fortunately, your pack will be a thing of the past any day now. Carver picked up the empty tray and turned and left. She hurled a hardcover book at his head as he walked out, just barely missing. She slept poorly that night, tossing and turning. She kept waking up and wondering what was happening back at her pack's property. She imagined wake up to news of a death challenge in the morning. A shifter named Michael brought her breakfast and a change of clothing, jeans and a t-shirt. Michael was one of Maddox's cousins, a few years older than him. Half an hour later he came back. You ready? With a scowl she followed him out the door and let him lead her through several hallways and out a door. She made careful note of where everything was in case she got a chance to escape. The grounds were typical of shifter properties, houses built in harmony with nature, nestled in among the lodgepole pines. Paths led through the trees leading to the various houses. As she followed him her gaze swept the area as she quickly oriented herself. The mountains were to the east. When they'd entered the pack property in the back of the van, it had taken about 2 minutes before they'd stopped at the big house where she was being held. She noted where the underbrush was thickest. It would provide her with decent cover if she could escape and make a break for it, heading for rural Route 270. From there she could run all the way back to her pack property. 10 miles of running, piece of cake if she could just get off the property in the first place. She knew that like all packs, the Killingworth pack would have shifters on patrol at all times. The property wasn't fenced in, though if she could get enough of a head start she might be able to make it. She checked her window last night. There was an alarm system and the sensor was on the outside of the window. If she opened the window it would set off the alarm. And then there were the bars. She'd have to start investigating the room in earnest to look for things she could improvise into weapons or tools. The mattress was made of down and had no bed springs. It rested on wooden slats, no sharp metal that she'd be able to locate. Michael led her into a clearing where various picnic benches and chairs were scattered about. There was an area with a fire pit. There was an outdoor kitchen next to some sheds and a big building that looked like a rec center, a covered pavilion with rows of seats in front of it, the pack's common area. Then a couple of dozen women were sitting on both sides of a long picnic table. She strolled past them, not paying attention to Michael. He followed close behind. She didn't bother to try to say hello to them, figuring they'd be as to her. as everyone else had been lately, but to her surprise one of them looked up and smiled at her. "There you are." A middle-aged woman with carrot-colored hair and freckles moved over on the bench to make room for her. "I'm Caroline. I wanted to thank you for being so nice to my niece. You really made her day. She couldn't stop talking about you." "Of course," she said privately. She thought, "Geez, why is everyone surprised that I was nice to her? I'm mad as hell that I'm here, but I'm not going to take it out on a cub." Michael sat down, cross-legged in the grass near their table, watching her out of the corner of his eye. There were spools of burlap ribbon on the table and glass mason jars and glue and oval paper labels and baskets of arts and craft supplies. "We're making favors and decorations for my daughter's bridal shower," Caroline said. Katrina perked up. This was right up her alley. "I help run our PAX catering business. You know what we did for my cousin's bridal shower," she said. "What a pretty redhead who looked like a much younger version of Caroline looked up with interest. I'm the bride-to-be. We made lace chairs that had little tiny holsters on them with many bottles of liquor." "All right, she's definitely coming to the wedding. I want her for each leg," P said eagerly. "That's horribly inappropriate for a bridal shower." An older woman who was sitting near the end of the table chided her, forehead wrinkling in distaste. Peon bit her lip and her face fell. "Then don't wear one." "Myrtle," Caroline said, and icicles were dripping from her voice. Myrtle, a stout blonde with a frosted helmet of hair, made a tisking sound and went back to curling ribbons with her pair of scissors. She reminded Katrina of the women her mother associated with, women who all kite about each other behind each other's backs and lived to find people to look down on. Mother-in-law to be. Katrina was guessing. "What else you got?" Penny said to Katrina. Katrina started reeling off lists of bridesmaids' activities. As she spoke, she suddenly felt as if waves of hostility were radiating at her sensitive side. Why couldn't her psychic powers pick up on happy emotions, for God's sake? Glancing around, her gaze lighted on a slim schwulf with flat-ironed golden hair who was sitting at a nearby table flanked by two other very pretty women, and all of them were shooting looks of disgust in Katrina's direction. Katrina ignored them. She hadn't expected everyone to be delighted by her presence. "So where is Heather?" she asked Caroline. "We brought her back to her father's house this morning. Maddox tore him a new one last night and he swore he'd lay off the booze." Caroline said he was sober and cleaning up the house when we left, but we'll check back on them today. She began introducing Katrina to the women around the table. Maddox's great-grandmother Violet was sitting next to Katrina. She was a woman in her late 90s. There were various Killingworth family members and some from smaller PACs that were under the Killingworth PAC's protection. Katrina realized with a start that one of the women at the table sitting at the far end was Teresa, formerly from her PAC. Teresa, a pretty young widow, had packed up her two sons and left the Morehouse PAC a couple of months earlier. Katrina had been surprised. She'd never seen any indication that Teresa was unhappy. Maybe she'd been keeping it bottled up. "Hello, Teresa," she said, nodding. Teresa nodded back a little hesitantly as if she feared Katrina would hold a grudge. A woman brought out a tray with jugs of iced tea and frosty iced glasses. Katrina drank tea with them and shared recipes and ideas for the shower. She'd been sitting out there for about an hour when she felt a sudden warm tingling feeling and looked across the yard. She saw Maddox standing under the spreading branches of a huge oak tree talking to a few of his packmates. The sun was shining behind him, bathing his perfectly muscled body in its glow. She felt her skin tingle and a rush of moisture dampened her panties. Her breath hitched in her throat. Gee, why did her body have to react like that? She turned away, picked up a mason jar, and copying what the other women were doing, cut a length of burlap ribbon and tied it in a bow around the jar. She could feel Maddox walking Towards her the closer he got the more flustered she felt. She'd never really noticed his scent before, the masculine musk that he exuded, but now it was all she could smell. For the cubs in the wedding party, we had them sitting at tables with chalkboard tops and we gave them all bags of colored chalk, she said to the other women, although she was mostly speaking to distract herself. Maddox was right behind her, his shadow fell across the table. She could feel her cheeks flush and her breathing quickened. She hoped he wouldn't notice. "Good morning, fancy meeting you here," he said. She twisted around to look up at him and flashed a feral smile. "Haven't seen much of you." Scared, he returned the smile on him. It was more of a smirk. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd miss me so much." Oh, she wanted to smack that smug look off his handsome face. She snorted in contempt. "In your dreams and my nightmares. Run along now, Fifi, I think you're overdue with the groomer." He threw back his head and laughed, then walked off. Katrina turned back to cut another ribbon and realized that everyone was staring at her. "What?" she said. "Something in my teeth." "The hey, you talked to him?" Caroline marveled. She snurred. "What about it? He never lets anybody talk to him like that." Caroline shook her head. "I mean, he's the alpha." Teresa nodded and glanced at the woman next to her. "I swear, Susie, it was almost like." Susie nodded vigorously. "It was exactly like what?" "Oh, nothing." They both pretended to be very interested in scribbling names on labels before Katrina could push them on it. The woman who'd been glaring walked over with her friends and they made a big show of sitting down at the table. "I went into town to get some new lingerie," the woman said loudly. "I don't even know why I bother with it since Maddox is going to rip it off me in 2 seconds. She shot a significant look in Katrina's direction. "He just can't get enough of you," one of the other females exclaimed loudly. "What's his favorite position again?" As the woman began loudly describing various sex acts, the other females at the table glanced at each other in annoyance. "Good Lord," Katrina got it. The female was with Maddox. She was a jealous, and for some reason she thought Katrina was a threat. The idea of Maddox with such a crude, tactless female disturbed her. For some reason Maddox deserved better. Now where the hell had that thought come from? One of the older women slammed her palm down on the table. "Enough, Lula," she said. "There are cubs approaching." Lula and her friends let out threatening growls. The women responded with snarls and menacing glowers. Lula glared at them for a few seconds, then stood up. "Let's go find somewhere a little classier to hang out." Lula sniffed and she and her 2 friends flounced off. "Cookie, dear," Violet said, holding out a plate of sugar cookies to Katrina. Katrina took one. "So where are you and Maddox going on your honeymoon?" Violet asked. Katrina choked on her cookie, spewing crumbs on the table. Without waiting for Katrina to answer, V said to Caroline, "I think she and Maddox make the loveliest couple, don't you?" "Oh yes, perfect," Caroline said, and when Violet looked away she glanced at Katrina and made a little circle at her temple with her finger. Violet was all she'd have to be to imagine that Katrina and Maddox were together. "When do you think you will bless us with grand CBS?" the older woman asked. Katrina struggled for a diplomatic answer. Finally she said, "Oh well, it's all so new. We just want to spend some time together first." "Good decision, dear. Are you hoping for a boy or a girl first?" "I'm partial to girls myself. I can make you some clothing." "Oh, I'll start sewing a little onesie right away. I have a lovely pattern." "What are you naming her?" One of the other women patted her on the arm. "Enough, Violet, we don't want to put so much pressure on the new bride," she said with a wink at Katrina. "Let the newlyweds enjoy themselves." Violet stared at her in puzzlement. "Newlyweds who got married? Why doesn't anybody tell me these things?" A little while later they wrapped up their party favors and made Katrina promise to meet them tomorrow morning at the same spot to do some planning for the bridal feast. She got up to take a stroll and Michael scrambled to his feet to follow her. She wondered how far he'd let her wander before steering her back To her room. She might as well find out it was all recon. Even though she was being treated well, she still needed to make every effort to escape. Her pack's pride was at stake. Had her stepfather issued a death challenge yet? Wouldn't Maddox have mentioned something like that? She paused, standing and soaking in the sunlight, listening to the parrot-like squawk of the acorn woodpeckers and the high shrill chirp of the sparrows. As she stood there, a sudden wave of terror rolled over her. Heather was terrified. Heather needed help. It was her mutant gene as a sensitive flaring up and making Heather's panic echo inside her. It called out to her like a blaring beacon, again drowning out everything else in the world. Without thinking, she shifted, her clothes shredded off of her. She dropped to all fours and took off like a shot. She ran towards the fear. All of her senses blazed to life, and the wind carried the faintest scent of Heather towards her, as well as several other oddly familiar wolf scents. Where did she know those scents from? She raced through the woods and leaped over underbrush, dodging around trees, legs churning, ears flat back against her head. Behind her she heard shouts and then howls. She kept running. Something flew through the air and knocked her off her feet with a thud, and then she was staring up into the eyes of the most massive gray wolf she'd ever seen. Maddox, that son of a, she snapped wildly as he pinned her down with his paws. Three of his packmates paced nearby, growling loudly. Then she shifted back to human form. She needed to be able to talk. He shifted too, and all of a sudden she was pinned down on soft loamy forest floor under his naked bulk. She could feel his muscles rippling as he grabbed her flailing hands and pinned them above her head. His brown hair hung down and he was panting hard and grinning fiercely. In the mood for a jog? You should have just said so. I'd have laced up my sneakers, Maddox taunted. It's Heather. She's in the woods and something's happening to her, she cried out, squirming and struggling underneath him. She could feel the hard length of his pressing into her stomach. The scent of his musky arousal rolled over her. That's the best you got? I thought you house shifters were good at lying, you stupid son of a. Do you think I'd try to escape in front of everyone in broad daylight? Just because you're beautiful doesn't mean you're smart. Off in the distance she felt Heather's panic growing, screaming out to her, get off me, she howled, trying without success to knee him in the balls. Instead he bent down and sniffed her hair. But you smell so pretty. Then he stopped and his expression went from taunting to serious fear. I smell fear. You're not lying. Northeast of here. Help her, she cried out. He scrambled to his feet and shouted out to his packmates, and then shifted. Katrina shifted too. They all raced northeast, easily outrunning her, and she fell behind, following them. It occurred to her as she ran that she could possibly escape now because they were all distracted, but no, she had to help Heather. She couldn't leave until she knew the little girl was all right. Ahead she heard shouts of rage, followed by howls and terrible gurgling noises that she recognized. Wolves were dying. By the time she got there it was all over. 3 shifters lay dead on the forest floor. Maddox and his men had already shifted back into human form. Carver was kneeling and comforting Heather, who was crying into his shoulder. Heather, did they hurt you? Katrina cried out. Good God, hadn't this cub been through enough already? Heather rushed over to Katrina, who wrapped her arms around her protectively. Those men tried to take me, she wailed. Why did they try to take me? I didn't want to go with them. What were you doing out here? Maddox asked her. She wiped her face with her arm. My daddy drank his medicine from the bottle and fell asleep, and I couldn't wake him up, and I got bored, she sniffed. I just wanted to go for a run, a very common cub thing to do, and on her pack land she should have been safe. Maddox's face went dark with anger. Take Heather to Caroline, he said to Carver, and alert everybody. Nobody goes in the woods alone until this is resolved. Double up on security. Meeting in 1 hour with everyone on the pack council. Wait, isn't Katrina coming too? Heather asked anxiously. I need her to protect me. I'll see you later today, and this time we'll do 2 French braids with ribbons, but only if you go with Carver right now. No arguing, Katrina said. Heather perked up immediately and let Carver scoop her up and carry her off without complaint. As Carver headed back towards the common area, Maddox glanced over at Katrina. How did you know Heather was in trouble? I'm a sensitive. I have a natural tendency to pick up on very strong emotions of anyone around me. I'm surprised I picked up on Heather being this far away from me. I must have really formed an emotional bond with her, and then again her panic was really strong, and I tend to pick up on negative emotions the most. Unfortunately, Maddox nodded curtly. Good talent to have. What will happen with her father? He's out of the pack. He'd been warned before. Ouch. Katrina winced. Rehab we offered before. He turned it down. When we escort him off the property, we'll offer it again. He can do it or not, his choice, unless he can prove to us that he's rehabilitated. He's lost his cub and his peak. She sighed. It was sad for Heather. She wished there were an alternative. You think I'm being overly harsh? Maddox asked, surprising her. He actually cared what she thought. Well, I know. I just wish circumstances were different, but they're not. I understand why you're laying down the law. You've given him plenty of chances. He's not supervising his own child, and being raised by a binge-drinking alcoholic is terrible for her. I hope he decides to accept help. Maddox turned his attention back to the 3 dead shifters. I need to know who sent them. I swear they smell familiar, Katrina said. She walked closer, peering at the 3 dead men, their blood staining the forest floor, their lifeless eyes staring at the sky. A shock ran all the way through her body. I know them, she says. Maddox let out a growl. Are they members of your pack? He asked. She shook her head. No, they're in a P that my stepfather wanted to take over. It's Tristan, the alpha of the Lowlands pack, and his beta and his brother. I don't understand why they were here. He glared at their bodies. Isn't it obvious? Retaliation for taking you hostage. It's just not how my stepfather would operate. He wouldn't send a relatively weak alpha and 2 men onto your property to grab a cub. I mean, you saw how ineffective they are. It would just make him look bad, and also nobody goes after cubs. At Maddox's scornful look, she said with exasperation, seriously, you jerk off? That's the kind of thing that would bring the Council of Elders down on his head. He wouldn't want to risk that. The council oversaw death challenges, but they didn't usually get involved in day-to-day pack affairs unless someone had violated the covenant, the code of conduct that governed all wolf shifters. Cubs were off limits. Nobody went after another pack's cubs. Maddox glanced back at their bodies, his brows drawn together. Maybe he came after us to impress your stepfather. No, if anything, from what I'd heard, he was so against my stepfather taking over his pack that he was ready to accept a death challenge even though he was sure to lose. This makes no sense at all. Well, they're here, and somehow or other I get the feeling that your stepfather was behind it. It's time to end this. MCK said. We need to go back now. Things to do, shifters to kill. Let's unmove it. Katrina let him lead her back to the main pack area with a dull feeling of despair settling deep in the pit of her stomach. No matter who won, hearts would be broken and things were going to change forever for both packs. Chapter 4. Maddox had Katrina wait outside of his office. She'd requested the opportunity to speak to her family and he'd granted it. Why not? It just rubbed their snouts in the fact that he'd taken her hostage. First things first, he was being put through to Roman, who apparently had been expecting his call. He leaned back in his upholstered other chair, phone held to his ear as it rang. Carver stood by the door, arms folded over his chest, watching. Maddox heard a click on the other end. Hello. Roman's voice was cold and betrayed no emotion. Nice try, your idiot minions failed, Maddox said in a low grumbling growl. They died like cowards, howling for mercy. I challenge you to a death match in the arena. Roman Kaufman said quickly. Without even asking what Maddox meant, took you long enough. Name the date and time. Noon, July 1st. Now that was a surprise. Did Roman need an entire month to get prepared? Every Alpha was always in a state of readiness for a challenge. Maddox was sure that Roman trained daily and kept in peak physical condition just as Maddox did. How about tomorrow? He wanted to get this over with. Are you hard of hearing? I said July 1st. Maddox growled at the insult, but he had no choice since Roman had been the one to issue the challenge. He got to pick the date. Maddox had just never heard of the time being expanded out so far. He almost felt as if Roman had rushed to issue the death challenge so he could pick the date. But why? What possible advantage would there be to waiting a month? If it had been any longer than that, he'd have appealed to the council. Hell, he could even appeal to them now. He thought about it. Of course, the entire time they were waiting, he'd have to keep Katrina here. To return her would be a sign of weakness. Speaking of which, fine, spend your month training, old man. Not that it will help. And now your stepdaughter wants to speak to you. I'm going to put you on hold while I wait for her because I've reached my tolerance level for the Morehouse pack today. He set the phone down and gestured at Carver, who went to fetch Katrina. Katrina walked in looking wary and came behind the desk. He inhaled deeply through his nose before he could stop himself. Why did she have to smell so damn delicious? He picked up the phone again. Even though you are weak and unable to control or protect the members of your pack, I choose to permit you to speak to our hostage. He handed the phone to Katrina, ignoring Roman's snarls of anger and shouts of rage. Something about Maddox drowning in his own blood, blah blah blah. Roman, please quit yelling. It's me, Katrina said. Is everyone all right? Of course, why wouldn't they be? Roman said, sounding offended as if she were questioning his leadership. She wished she could ask him about what was happening in town and why everyone was so upset with their pack, but with him in this mood, it wasn't the best time. She also couldn't talk about it in front of Maddox. Frustration welled up inside her. Roman seemed to listen to her pretty well when she talked to him in person. When her mother was there, he pretty much worshipped the ground her mother walked on. Not surprising, because her mother made the perfect trophy wolf and was every bit as socially ambitious as Roman, if not more. Yet another reason she needed to get off this damned property. She really needed a face-to-face with him. How badly have they mistreated you? Roman asked. I need to report all of their violations to the Council of Elders. They have not treated me other than kidnapping me. I mean, but I'm being fed well and nobody has abused me. They are behaving according to the Covenant. The Covenant had specific rules about how hostages were to be treated. I doubt that the Killingworth pack ever follows the rules of the Covenant, Roman said, his voice cold. Katrina bit back an angry response. Was he calling her a liar? What the hell was up his butt today? I can only report what I observed, she said stiffly. She wasn't being particularly diplomatic, but screw it, he was being a dick and she'd never seen the point of fake social niceties. Maddox was standing next to her, leaning on the desk. She tried not to let it distract her. Whenever he was close to her, she felt that warm flush sweep through her body and her heart sped up as if she'd just run a marathon. She prayed he didn't notice he was stuck up enough already. Your mother wishes to speak to you. Roman's tone was frosty. Janet, can you come here? She heard a rustling sound and then her mother's grieved voice. Katrina dear, you will of course remember to represent our pack well, her mother said. Katrina felt a ripple of exasperation roll over her. She'd been kidnapped and that's what her mother had to say to her. Not that she should be surprised. Of course I am, she said impatiently. Remember your manners. We must show those beasts that we are superior to them. You are eating with the correct forks and spoons. Of course the only time Katrina bothered to eat with the proper forks and spoons, as she'd been taught in etiquette school, was when She ate with her family. She tried to make sure that happened as infrequently as possible. Mother, they only use one set of silverware, for heaven's sake. Good, her mother crowed. Then ask for a proper table setting, and when they refuse you need to say very loudly that it doesn't surprise you that these beasts never learned proper table manners. Oh, I know, say that they must have gotten their etiquette training at the dog pound. She sounded utterly delighted with herself. Katrina rolled her eyes. Yes. That'll sure show them. In fact, it's a little harsh. It might make them cry. Katrina Kaufman, are you disrespecting me? And in the presence of another pack, I cannot believe all of the money that I've spent trying to teach you to behave properly, and even after all this, my last name's not Kaufman, it's Hagen. You married Roman, I didn't. She yelled and slammed the phone down on the receiver. Maddox sat there on the table trying to suppress his laughter. Would you like me to rustle up some more silverware for you? I swear to freaking God. Katrina stamped on the floor. She began pacing. Seriously, I'm being held hostage, and the only thing my mother cares about is making sure that I announce that our family is better than everyone else. My mother is the shallowest, most pretentious. Then she stopped and bit her lip. She just insulted her pack in front of their mortal enemies. Everything that she was saying was true, and she'd lashed out because her mother had hurt her feelings by, as usual, caring more about appearances than she cared about Katrina. But she shouldn't have revealed this to an outsider. Forget I said that, she said. He raised an eyebrow, looking puzzled. Forget you said what? Thank you. Great. And now thanks to her mother she owed Maddox for actually being decent. She couldn't decide who she was maddest at right now. Thank me for what? By the way, your stepfather requested that the challenge be held in 1 month, an entire month. She stared at him. What the hell? Why? She felt uneasiness ripple through her. Roman had reasons for everything that he did. He was a master manipulator. Was he planning on doing something to Maddox? In the meantime, she was tempted to tell Maddox to test all of his food before he ate it, but then she'd be collaborating with the enemy. She forced her concerns down. This was what it meant to be a shifter. Alphas challenged, they protected their pack, they kept order. Sometimes they died doing it. I have no idea. Maddox shrugged, not seeming at all concerned. But you know that I can't send you back before then. She'd be stuck around this infuriating slab of man meat for an entire month, ever since he'd grabbed her back at the town common. Her animal instincts were going crazy. Something about his touching her all of a sudden, his mere presence, made her body betray her, sending shivers of arousal through her whenever he got near. She couldn't want MCTS. The Killingworth and Morehouse packs were oil and water, they didn't mix. She could just imagine sauntering up to her mother and stepfather and announcing, hey, Maddox Killingworth is my new mate. It would be a toss-up whether her stepfather would ban her or kill her, or ban her dead body, as if Maddox even wanted her for a mate. She reminded herself it wasn't like he was off-airing. She needed to stay as far away from him as possible. She just throw herself into helping out with planning out the bridal shower and wedding day festivities and do her best to pretend he didn't exist. We'll have clothing brought to you, Maddox told her. We can give you a TV and DVD player and you can go out during the day as long as you have a guard. I'm tired, she said stiffly. I'd like to go back to my prison cell, I mean room. As she turned to walk out of the room with Carver trailing after her, Maddox called out, Katrina. She turned back with a quizzical look on her face. Thanks for saving Heather today. You could have used that opportunity to escape. Don't remind me, she muttered and let Carver lead her back to her room. Good God, if her stepfather ever found out that she could have escaped but stayed behind to help a Killingworth cub, there would be hell to pay. Chapter 5. It was noon and the Bitter Brew Tavern was crowded. Carver set his beer stein Down and scowled. Damned Morris Pack, they'd been an arrogant, obnoxious, in-your-face bunch of as far back as he could remember, and they'd gotten even worse when Roman Kaufman took over. As for Katrina, he saw the way Maddox looked at her, even if Maddox didn't realize it himself yet. He'd always suspected Maddox had a thing for her going back years. He was actually kind of worried about Maddox, not that he'd ever tell his Alpha that Bambi, the coyote shifter who'd come to meet him, put her hand on his knee and ran it up his thigh. He felt his harden and swell, straining at his jeans. "What are you looking so grouchy about, Wolfie? You're with me." She fluttered her lashes at him and he grinned. They had a casual thing where they got together from time to time and he always looked forward to it. That was exactly what he needed today, a break from the drama. Back, unpack property, a little afternoon delight. "Aren't I a lucky wolf?" He leaned forward and kissed her hard, cupping her face in his hand and thrusting his tongue into her mouth. There was no emotion there, no tenderness, just deep hungry need, and she responded eagerly in kind. When he finally pulled away, she let out a high-pitched giggle. "I need to go use the little girl's room and then we should swing by my place. You haven't broken my bed springs in a while, you naughty wolf." She wanked at him and slid off the bar stool, sauntering off towards the bathroom. Okay, her penchant for cutesy talk was starting to grate on his nerves a little bit, but it's not like he actually spent any time with her outside of the bedroom. "No big deal," he told himself. One of the wolves at the bar let out a loud howl of approval and he turned to see what the wolf was looking at. Well, hello, a stunning female brunette wolf shifter had just walked through the door. Her long straight brown hair was thick and shiny. She wore black jeans and a tank top and motorcycle boots. Yes please, he thought. Damn, now he was sorry he was with Bambi. If he hadn't agreed to meet her today, he'd have gone for that she-wolf in a heartbeat. She met his gaze and headed straight for him. Well, this was awkward. Could he get away with asking for her number while Bambi was in the bathroom? It's not like he and Bambi were exclusive. She'd been with a hyena shifter the night before. One of his friends had told him she was standing right in front of him now, one blue eye, one green. That meant she was a healer. Right now he had a swelling that definitely could use some attention. Her body was trim and firm. She had lush red lips. The mild arousal that Bambi had stirred in him earlier was nothing compared to the blazing lust roaring through his body right now. "Carver Killingworth," her voice caressed him. "Sweet as honey, at your service." He winked at her. "Take that any way you like it, please." She didn't take it exactly the way he'd expected. She grabbed a pitcher of beer from the and dumped it over his head, leaving him drenched and spluttering with outrage. "What the hell?" he shouted as the whole bar erupted in howls of laughter and she turned and sauntered off without a word. What was that? Who was she? Bambi had cut her trip to the bathroom short. "Sweetheart, I have no idea. I've never seen her before." He grabbed a napkin from the bar and mopped off his face. "Do I look stupid?" she yelled. He hesitated. He believed in being honest, which meant that he shouldn't answer that question. "Well," she pressed him angrily, "there's no way that woman just randomly decided to dump a pitcher of beer on your head. You know her fine. If you like her so much better than me, why don't you go __ her instead?" She gestured at a coyote who'd been playing pool. "Ferdinand, want to get laid? Today's your lucky day." Ferdinand dropped his pool cue on the floor and hurried after her as she stalked out the door. Great. So now Carver was drenched in beer, horny as hell, and had no freaking idea what had just happened to him. One thing he knew for sure though, he'd love to get that she-wolf's number. "Sorry buddy." Katrina glanced down at the unconscious body of Jaden, her guard for the day. Jaden had made the mistake of turning his back on her while she and he were out for a walk in the woods. All she'd had to do was tell him she needed a pee and she'd appreciate Some damn privacy already. He'd underestimated her. Sure, he could hear her if she tried to run off, but she wasn't an idiot. She'd never try that. Instead, she gave him a quick karate chop to the neck at exactly the right pressure point, and he crumbled to the ground unconscious. She might be small and female, but she had taken self-defense classes her daddy had taught her well. She quickly shed her clothes and rolled them up, grabbed them with her mouth, and shot through the woods like an arrow. She didn't have much time before someone came looking for her and Jaden. To her enormous relief, she made it all the way off pack property and she headed towards town. Her pack was about 5 miles on the other side of Greenville. Once she was in town, she could call someone to come get her. She was hoping against hope that when she got back she could get her mother and stepfather together and see if they could come up with an alternative to the death challenge. There must be a way that Morris and the Killingworth pack could work together and be allies. They'd be an incredibly strong pack. She'd pitch it to Roman, but if he won the death challenge, a good portion of the Killingworth pack, possibly all of them, would just pack up and leave. Now that the elders had made that an option, they'd rather give up their lands and all their possession than serve under the Killingworth pack. They'd go somewhere else, find an unclaimed area of land and rebuild from scratch. If on the other hand the Killingworth pack made an alliance with the Morris pack, there would be two strong packs. Together they dominate the whole region. Nobody would go up against them. She also needed to talk to Roman about how the townspeople were reacting to everyone lately. She would put it diplomatically, of course. She'd explain in business terms it was all public relations and marketing. If he could make people like him, they'd be more likely to side with him during conflict and more likely to do business with him. When she got to the edge of town, she paused, turned, and walked into the one place she was sure wouldn't turn her away. Morgan Stern's, the art store on the edge of town. Her friend Frances, a Puma shifter, worked there. Her mother owned the place. She and Frances had been really close in high school, and Frances was the nicest, sweetest girl she knew, except Frances went stiff when she walked in and her expression was not friendly. Frances, quick, I need to use your phone, she said. She was sure that the Killingworth pack were hot on her trail already. They'd be here in minutes. Frances winced and shook her head. Not without permission from Maddox or one of his officers. I can make a call and ask him. What, seriously? Frances didn't answer, just stood there with her hands on the counter. Frances, what is going on here? This is crazy. Why is it that my own friends won't even talk to me? Frances raised an eyebrow. I'm friends with Stacy too. So am I. Remember that pajama party where we raided Stacy's parents' liquor cabinet? And what does being friends with Stacy have to do with anything? Why don't you ask the Gophers? Frances blurted out. Then she went pale. Forget I said that. Please don't say anything to your stepfather. I won't. Katrina was puzzled. Frances, I don't understand why you're treating me like this. If you're upset with something that my stepfather has done, that's fine, but do you think I've suddenly changed into a terrible person? Frances looked her right in the eye. You live on pack property. You of all people must know what goes on there. Why me of all people? You're sensitive. You pick up on emotions when people that you've met are in pain or frightened, if they're physically close enough to me. Yeah, but what? She trailed off. There's a large portion of our property that's off limits right now because my uncle is building some new buildings for a furniture factory and stuff like that, like miles and miles of it. Are you suggesting that something is going on there? Maybe you should do a little exploring. Frances was still wary, but her belligerent tone had turned uncertain. If Roman will let you, she added, raising an eyebrow. The front door jingled and swung open. Katrina turned around to face Jaden and Maddox. She wanted to scream with frustration. This was unbelievable. She'd been so close, and Francis had probably seen her coming and called the Killingworth pack before she'd walked in the door. Still, they'd gotten her more quickly than she would have expected. Francis shrugged apologetically and walked away into the back section of the store. Well, if it isn't Tweedledee and Tweedledummer. She looked at Jaden. That was fast. Yeah, you need to work on your technique a little bit. Princess Maddox flashed a feral grin. I figured you might try something like this, told Jaden to just play along if you did. I was curious as to what you'd do. I drove to town and I had my men following you far enough behind that you couldn't scent them. She just stared at him silently, thinking of all the things she could do with a wolfskin pelt, matching jacket and boots, a fur vest. I think this is the part where you start screaming, throwing things and questioning my manhood. Maddox was striding towards her, him and his ridiculous t-shirts which showed off his huge biceps and molded to his washboard abs. Big stupid show-off. You'd have to be in possession of some manhood in order for me to question it. She bet the words out. There we go. He flashed his white teeth in an infuriating smile. Had me worried there for a second. Now which way are we going to do it this time? Am I going to carry you or are you going to walk? Either way is good with me. I will walk. She strode angrily towards the door and the two of them followed right on her heels, steering her towards a pickup truck. Chapter 6. It was 7 a.m. but the common area was already bustling with activity in different parts of the yard. Shifters were drying herbs, chopping firewood, or socializing and eating breakfast at picnic tables. Katrina sat at the picnic table where Caroline and the others were gathered and let out a huge yawn as Caroline set a cup of coffee down in front of her. She'd slept badly again last night. Different shifters kept bringing meals to her room. It was never Maddox. This irritated her on a very deep level, although she wasn't sure why. Michael had again been assigned to guard duty and he sat nearby chatting up his girlfriend, a shifter named Roberta. All of the women who'd been at the table the day before were back with their craft supplies laid out. Caroline had brought out Katrina a notebook so she could jot down some ideas for the bridal feast. Thanks for the coffee. What's on the agenda for today? Katrina was incredibly grateful to have this wedding coming up. We were hoping you could share your recipe for those mini sausage snacks you made for Riverville 150th anniversary celebration. Caroline said, I actually had some. They were amazing, loved them. P added, we won't be having them for the wedding reception though. Myrtle said, much too casual and lowbrow now for my reception, which was done in excellent taste. Well, excuse me, I was talking, she said as P got up and stormed off. Caroline rushed after P but P waved her off and kept walking. Katrina got up and jogged over to Caroline. Let me try. Sometimes people will talk to a friend more than they will a family member, she said. Caroline shrugged helplessly. She caught up to P who was walking fast and blinking back tears. Michael trailed behind Katrina, watching her closely. I'm pretty sure I'm calling the wedding off, P said, wiping her nose with her hand. I'm sorry I wasted everyone's time with all of this planning. I know your mother-in-law is but once the wedding is over you can just avoid her, can't you? Katrina asked. Unless you feel like he's not the right one for you. That's just it. He's perfect for me in every way except for this thing with his mother. And she announced that she's building a house right next to ours so she can come over every day and cook and clean, because I obviously never got any training in those departments and there's no reason to think that I'll suddenly learn how just because I'm married. So great. She's insulting my parents and me at the same time, and she said that when I have cubs she'll need to be there to help raise them, right? Alexander was sitting right there and he didn't say a word. Oh hells no, Katrina swore. You're right, you need to find him and take a stand. Post haste, she cannot live next to you, and unless She starts treating you with respect and stops insulting you all the time. There's no reason she should set paw in your house. Am I being unreasonable? I keep trying and trying to be nice to her no matter what she says. You are perfectly reasonable, Katrina said firmly. Go find him. This can't wait. Back at the picnic table, Caroline and the helmet-haired woman were shouting at each other, and the group quickly packed up their supplies and headed off, all except for Teresa, who gestured at Katrina to come talk to her. Katrina glanced over at Michael, who was standing 5 feet away. Do you mind, she said. Private conversation here. He shrugged and didn't move, scowling. Katrina led Teresa another 10 feet away. Maybe Teresa could give her some insight into whatever was happening with the Morris pack that she wasn't seeing. I just wanted to say that maybe you should stay here, Teresa said. You fit right in, and Maddox is obviously crazy about you. No, don't laugh, everybody's talking about it. Why do you think Lula is so jealous? She wants Maddox and he obviously wants you. Is there a collective case of crazy going around here? Katrina shook her head in astonishment. Maddox does not like me. Yes, he does, Teresa insisted. Every time there was some public event in town and both packs were there, I would see him watching you and ignoring all the other girls. He's very handsome, isn't he? And you know, Alpha, who doesn't want to be with an alpha? Enough said. They're right. She winked at her. More than enough. What would Katrina even do if Teresa were right? But of course she wasn't right. Maddox had never made a move on her. Teresa's sorry to change the subject, but I need to know, Katrina said. Why did you leave our pack? Was there something that made you unhappy? Well, your stepfather is a bit temperamental. She smiled politely. Was he abusive? Everyone in town is acting really weird to me. Maddox claims that it's because my stepfather has alienated everybody. I did not ever see him being abusive. Teresa was speaking very carefully. Was she trying not to offend Katrina, or was she that afraid of Roman? Even now that she was here at this camp, you know that I'd never tell Roman anything that you say, Katrina said. If there's a problem with his behavior, I need to know. I can talk to my mother. He always listens to her. Teresa sighed. Perhaps not as much as he used to. She turned and walked away. As much as he used to? They'd only been married 3 years. Katrina hadn't noticed anything wrong between him and her mother, but then she was starting to wonder if there was a lot going on that she hadn't noticed. She wondered what would happen to Teresa if her stepfather won. Surely Teresa must have been aware of that possibility. The Morehouse pack would take over the Killingworth pack, and then Teresa would almost certainly have to pack up and leave the area entirely. She turned to walk back towards the picnic table and slammed into Tallulah, who was for some reason walking through the common area holding a hot bowl of soup. The soup spilled down the front of Lula's shirt and Lula screamed in pain and instantly shifted to wolf form. Katrina followed suit, dropping down to all fours and growling as the hair stood up on her back. The female was considerably bigger than her, but as the saying went, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. The next thing she knew, Maddox was in between them in wolf form, snarling at the other woman. The woman immediately let out a whimper, fell to the ground and rolled onto her back to show submission. Maddox shifted back to human form and she and the woman did too. Now all three of them stood there naked. Katrina had to admit the woman had quite the impressive rack. There were red blotches on her skin. The soup had burned her. She attacked me, the woman wailed. She dumped scalding hot soup on me and burned me on purpose. I have the right to defend myself. I issue a challenge. Bring it, Katrina snapped. Maddox let out a snarl and both of them fell silent. Katrina could have kept arguing, but she didn't want to challenge his authority in front of everyone and put him in a bad spot. Wait, why not? She wondered. I saw what happened, Lula. Maddox said. You walked right up to her and bumped into her on purpose. There will be no challenge, understand? She hung her head sullenly and nodded. She doesn't belong here. She's not One of us, she muttered, her voice angry and rebellious. You don't get to make that decision. Pack up and move to one of the cabins in the far north section, and if you come near her again you'll be moving off the property. Do I make myself clear? Her lips parted and she stared searchingly at Maddox with an expression of yearning that somehow raised Katrina's hackles. Katrina felt fur rippling down her neck and back the way it would when she fought in wolf form. She didn't want any other females looking at Maddox like that. Her wolf howled inside her, wanting to be freed, wanting to stake its claim. My wolf is a dumb animal, Katrina reminded herself. She had no claim on him, nor did she want one. After a long moment Lula turned and walked away without answering Maddox. Chapter 7. Everything was falling perfectly into place. Of course it always did for him. You hear that father? Roman asked, his lip twisting in contempt. I win again. I always win. His father stared back at him with glassy eyes, literally glassy eyes, because after Roman had killed him, he'd had him stuffed by a taxidermist. He kept him in a secret room that he visited often. Every time he dominated someone, every time he humiliated someone, he came to remind his father how wrong he'd been about him. Roman kicked the big stuffed wolf, and as he did he felt a sharp twinge in his side and grimaced. A wolf had used a silver knife on him in an assassination attempt a few weeks earlier, and the wound still hadn't healed properly. It might never heal all the way. He brought in a healer to try their magic, and the healer had failed. He'd arranged for the healer's fatal accident immediately afterwards. Of course he couldn't risk the secret getting out. Do you think this makes me weak? Do you? He yelled at the wolf. What the hell do you know? If you're so smart, why am I standing here and you're a giant beanie baby? Answer me that. No answer. I thought so. His injury wasn't even putting the slightest crimp in his plans. He just manipulated Maddox into meeting him in the death arena and ensured that Maddox would lose. He'd also kidnapped Tristan's family and ordered Tristan to bring him a member of the Killingworth pack if he wanted to see them alive. He'd known Tristan would fail, and now Roman could walk right in and take over. There were no other alphas in Tristan's pack. Tristan had been on the verge of challenging him, and with the injury Roman would have lost, but he'd outsmarted his opponent and forced him to commit suicide by wolf. Roman lashed out at his father's stuffed corpse again, kicking him in the face. How's it feel to be on the other end? Jared Patrick Kaufman had been more than old school in his parenting methods. He'd been vicious as far back as Roman's memory reached. Patrick had used brutality and humiliation in an attempt to mold Roman into what he'd considered the perfect alpha. Two of Roman's brothers and one of his sisters had survived their upbringing. Only Roman had made it through, and the older he got, the more savage Patrick's punishments had been. Roman's mother had been too terrified of her husband to intervene. Roman didn't begrudge the beatings, the impossible challenges, the constant pain, hunger and fear that had marked his childhood. He planned to use those methods himself as soon as he started having alpha sons. What infuriated him was the public humiliation. Even when he succeeded in the tasks his father set for him, his father insulted him, held him up in front of the pack and called him a girl, kicked him hard enough to break bones, and dared him to utter a single whimper. Spit on his face. The intercom system on his desk chirped. Somewhere on the compound his lovely near-perfect bride was trying to get in touch with him. Roman leaned down and spit on his father's head. I'll be seeing you, he growled, and turned and left the room. His lovely Janet wanted him. Killing her husband and marrying her had been an enormous achievement for him, the next step in his ambitious plans. He'd had his eye on the Morthouse pack lands for a long time. He wanted their lumber business, their construction business. He wanted everything they had, including the beautiful, elegant Janet who gave him that entrance to the high society world that he'd always craved. She looked perfect on his arm, was as dedicated as he was to bettering her. position in the world and was nearly perfect in every way. She only had one tiny flaw. No matter, he'd found the solution to that problem too. In the meantime, she probably wanted to talk to him about the charity ball they'd be hosting. They'd managed to get 3 members of the Council of Elders to attend. He'd be keeping careful track of those who chose not to attend. He always remembered his allies, but it was his enemies that he kept in a special mental memory vault that he opened every night and revisited and held up for examination. It was 3 a.m. and someone was outside her window getting closer. Katrina lay perfectly still in bed. She'd always been a light sleeper, and especially so tonight with so many problems running through her mind. She heard a rattling, and then bars opened from the outside, and then the window slid open. Then a bag was tossed through, landing on the floor with a thud. She tensed. Bomb thrown in by Lula. After a few seconds, when nothing exploded, she sat up in bed and walked lightly over to see what mysterious gift she just received. She smelled no sentium. No sentium was an herb which disguised individual smells and masked an individual's identity, but it came with its own distinctive aromas. Somebody didn't want her to know who they were. The bag had been drenched in no sentium and contained a spray bottle of no enum as well. There was a tran gun and a cell phone, a cheap disposable one. Someone was trying to help her escape. She doubted that any of the Killingworth pack would risk this kind of move. Her money was on Teresa. She probably hoped that helping Katrina escape would win her favor. It could also be any of the other pack members who'd come over. She picked up the tran gun, which was specially designed to hold 4 darts. She bent over and sniffed at them. She was a little concerned about using a tran gun when she hadn't personally loaded the dart syringes, or at least gotten the syringes from a source that she knew and trusted. Dear Lord, did she smell cyanide in them? Well, that made it useless. Irritated, she set the gun down. She did not actually want to kill anyone. She could suck it up for a month if she had to. Everything would be resolved one way or another. Then she just have to hope that she could make it out without running into anybody. She quickly shed the pajamas that the Killingworth pack had provided for her and sprayed herself from head to toe with no sentium. That would increase her chances of getting past the centuries that Killingworth would have on patrol. No sentium grew in the wild, so if they smelled it, it wasn't likely to arouse their suspicions. She looked out the window. She didn't see anybody watching. They had no reason to think she'd be able to open the bars. She wrapped up an outfit and tied the clothes in a bundle with her cell phone in the center. She'd call for help when she got far enough away from the Killingworth pack property. Carefully, painstakingly, she slid out the window and dropped to the ground with a clothing bundle in her hand. Then she looked around her, shifted into W form, grabbed the bundle in her mouth and ran as fast as she could, headed towards the wooded area that would offer the most cover. With her wolf-enhanced senses, she could sense several wolves just around the corner of the main house. Her legs churned as she raced towards the tree line. Almost there, she smelled a familiar scent. Max, damn the luck. She ran faster, legs slashing through the ass, but he was on her in seconds and knocked her off of her feet. She shifted back to human form, and he did too. He lay on top of her. The night was warm and sultry. She was panting from her run. It was from her run, wasn't it? Well, he said with a grin. My little runner, don't you ever sleep? She crowed. I'm the alpha. I sleep with one eye open. She wondered if that was literally true. The only way to find out, of course, would be to sleep with him. Damn it, why did her thoughts always go in that direction these days? Get off me, she grumbled. You're enjoying this way too much. She could feel the hard length of his erection pressing into her stomach, and it sent a rush of wetness between her thighs. And you aren't? He grinned. He had her there. Her nipples were swollen and pressing against his chest, not in the Slightest she lied, news flash, werewolf sweetheart, I can scent your arousal. He moved slightly, his smooth skin sliding over hers, and smelled her hair, drawing his breath in deeply. You smell delightful. She shivered as a rush of red hot desire washed over her. She wanted him so badly, she ached for it. There was a throbbing pulse between her legs. Despite herself, she found her body moving to fit against his, sliding her hips under him. He stared down at her, hunger burning in his gaze, and brushed her hair out of her face with a surprisingly soft and gentle touch. He caressed her cheek with his thumb, and she bit back a moan. I wonder if you taste as good as you smell, she moaned out loud, then a wordless sound of pure arousal, and he wrapped one leg around her, bending down to kiss her. Her lips parted, and she felt her resistance melt away as her animal side took over. All she felt was urgent need, the desire to meld with him, to pull his thick heart inside her and thrust against him. His lips brushed against hers, sending a sizzle of pleasure through hers. And she waited for him to kiss her passionately, to take her. He pulled away and shook his head hard as if to refocus himself. No, he growled. She bit back a frustrated moan. No, what she said defensively. I didn't ask you anything. No, I can't take advantage of a hostage no matter how badly I want to. I mean, I normally don't want my hostages anyway, just you. She could hardly hear for the blood pounding in her ears. How badly exactly? He favored her with a ruel grin. Let's just say 90% of the blood in my body is concentrated in one place, and it's not my brain, and just so you know, it happens every time I see you, always has always. She bit her lip, moving underneath him just because she loved the way it felt to slide against his smooth hard body. You know, if you agreed to release me, then technically I wouldn't be your hostage anymore, then we could have sex. She couldn't believe she was saying that. Was she actually asking him to have sex with her? God, she was on the verge of begging for it, which would be so humiliating. Not surprised. Surprisingly, he laughed and shook his head. Nice try. Incredibly tempting. I'd do just about anything to be with you, Katrina, but not something that would harm my pack. Fine, you're a killing worth anyway. We're like matter and antimatter. If we got together, we'd probably explode. She scowled up at him. She just asked him to have sex with her, and he turned her down, even if it was for a really good reason. Explode is right. He grinned and then shook his head in exasperation. Damn it, why do I keep doing that? You drive me crazy, Katrina. If we weren't from rival packs, believe me, I'd be begging you. She squirmed underneath him, struggling to move him off of her. She was pleased to hear him groan in frustration. Does that bother you? Good. She glowered up at him. I just want you to know one thing. The fact that I am physically turned on by you at the immediate moment doesn't mean I actually like you, and it's not my brain thinking, it's my wolf. I haven't been mated in a while, and she wants. Who have you mated with? His eyes glowed with a strange angry light. Are you actually jealous? She asked, astonished. He scowled down at her. My wolfie is doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean any more than your wolf wanting me to take her long, deep and hard. Just my animal instincts rearing up. That's not the only thing rearing up, she thought desperately, longing to slide up to impale herself on him. Abruptly he rolled off her and sat up. The loss of his warmth, his touch, his skin against hers sent a shockwave of protest through her. She took a deep shuddery breath, and then she sat up too, hugging herself and scowling. So let's get back to business here. You escaped. How? I have friends, she said. What a shocker. Screw you. If only my PXS enforcers are investigating right now, they might already have discovered who tried to help you. His tone and expression turned serious. You realize that whoever did this committed treason against my pack. You know what the consequences are. She swallowed hard. She didn't want anyone to get in trouble for helping her, especially the fatal kind of trouble, which was very likely what he was talking about. She hoped it wasn't Teresa, or that whoever had helped wouldn't get Caught no comment, she said, although I would say that mercy is a very important attribute for an alpha. He snorted. Tell that to your stepfather. We're back to that, are we? Yep, you mouse me Killingworth, it's always back to that. Let's go back and see what they managed to uncover when they got back to the compound. However, he didn't lead her back to her room. Where am I going now? She asked as he led her down a long hallway. The room next to mine. He held open the door. As I said, I sleep very lightly there. Will also be a guard stationed at the window. My men will bring you your clothing and books. She walked in and slammed the door shut without a word. Great, now she'd be sleeping next to him for an entire month. She'd sent him every minute she was in her room. She'd picture him sleeping. Did he sleep naked? Would he be sleeping alone? Why was he torturing her like this? A few minutes later he came back and her body did that crazy thing it always did, her nipples instantly swelling to tender buds and her pulsing, sending urgent messages up to her brain. Want him. Want him, want him. You left your tran gun in your room, he said. Why, it's SM, as if there was cyanide mixed in with the tranquilizer. She said, if I'd have shot anybody I would have killed them. His brows drew together in a threatening scowl. Where did you get that gun? She hesitated a minute, then admitted, I don't know. His expression turned even angrier. Katrina, I need to know, and I'm not screwing around here. I will get an answer. His voice was harsh and his eyes had that gleam to them that explained his scary reputation. My feelings for you don't matter, that's my pack mem lives we're talking about here. Maddox, I seriously and truthfully have no idea. Someone apparently managed to pick the lock on the window bars and tossed in the no-enum and the tran gun. I see. He looked thoughtful. So you had your chance to kill me and you blew it. Don't get too full of yourself. I'm leaving that part up to my alpha. He turned and left the room before she had a chance to ask him exactly what feelings did he have for her. Chapter 8. It was a warm June night and the doors and windows of the big log cabin style meeting house were open. Maddox sat at the head of the table in the council meeting, resisting the urge to tap his fingers impatiently. This was his least favorite part of being an alpha. It was like being a CEO, sitting through meetings and having everybody update him. Carl, the head of business affairs, went first. It looks like Roman is trying to undercut our logging contracts. He's been going around offering much lower prices to new customers and promising to guarantee those new prices for at least 1 year. So far our customers have been loyal to us and have declined the offer out of concern for what would happen when that year is up, and also because Roman has something of a bad reputation. Carver, who was there to report on pack security issues, shrugged. We won't have to worry about it in a month, will we? Everyone else nodded. They all were utterly confident that Maddox would win. Maddox nodded. Still good to know. After a few more minutes of business updates, it was Carver's turn. We still haven't identified the person who tried to break Katrina out of her room. We've questioned everybody, searched all rooms on the property, both personal and public, and we've got nothing. My money is on someone who came over from the Morris Pack. Carver had been against Killingworth taking in the members of the Morris Pack at all. There had been 8 of them so far, and outwardly at least they were easy to deal with, eager to fit in, and hadn't caused any trouble. And we've still made no progress on tracing those calls made to the Morris Pack. Maddox asked. Somebody had made several calls to the Morris Pack's extension using a burner phone which had been found discarded in the bushes during a surprise security drill by Carver and his men. The pack always remained prepared for an attack. Nothing, Carver said. There were no fingerprints on it and no centium was applied to disguise the user's identity. It is possible that the person was just calling friends and family members that they missed. Cecilia said they might not have been spying on us. She was a school teacher in charge of education and always wanted to think the best of Everyone, it's possible bats could fly out of my ass, but it's not likely. Carver said, don't talk to my aunt that way. Her nephew Drew, the head of agriculture and livestock, snapped. Don't tell me what to do, Carver growled at him. Both men went hairy and their snouts elongated, and they bristled and snarled at each other for a few seconds until Maddox let out a sharp bark of anger. Enough, back to business, Carver. Watch your language around the ladies. Carver bowed his head to indicate his respect for the Alpha. Yes sir. Won't happen again. It probably would, because Carver tended to have a foul mouth, but he'd shut up for the time being. One more thing before I forget, Carver said. Heather's father hasn't checked into the rehab center yet. It's been 3 days since we kicked him out. Maddox nodded curtly. He didn't expect this to end well. After the meeting, he went outside and walked through the common area. On his way back to his orders, he felt that warm, pleasurable swell sweep over his body, which meant that Katrina was somewhere nearby. It was dark out, and the electric lanterns cast yellow pools of light on the central common square and lit the paths between the buildings. She sat at a picnic table in the common area with Heather, who was her shadow these days. A shifter named Philly was on guard duty. Caroline and Peony and Teresa were there too. From what he'd been told, Peony had just announced she was delaying her marriage to Alexander. Alexander claimed he had no idea why, and P refused to talk about it. Emotions and relationships weren't really Maddox's thing, so he'd let it go. Katrina and Heather were leaning in over some crafts project, their heads bent towards each other, off in their own little world. Was Katrina think of him as much as he thought of her? He'd been doing his very best to avoid Katrina for the past few days, but it was getting harder and harder to deny the hunger and need that swelled up inside him. He didn't bother to slake that thirst with any of the other pack females. He knew it wouldn't satisfy him, and on some level he knew it would hurt Katrina, and he didn't want to do that. He'd sent other wolves in to bring her breakfast, had other wolves guarding her while she was hanging out with the rest of the pack during the day. It didn't help. He couldn't stop thinking about that night a few days past when he'd lain on top of her soft naked body and smelled the intoxicating scent of her aroma, the sound of her moans when he moved. When he bent down to kiss her, he realized that without even meaning to, he was headed over to her table. Well, that was okay. He had a matter he needed to discuss with her. Anyway, he saw Katrina tense up when he got close, a subtle change in body language that only he would notice. She sensed him when he was near, the same way that he did her. Katrina, he said when he got to the table, I need to talk to you. When Katrina got up, Heather tried to follow her, but Katrina leaned down and said something to her. Heather looked unhappy. Katrina let him lead her away from the table into a dark area of the property. Well, a rare sighting of the shifter species known as the common North American jackass. I gather that you've come to your senses and you're letting me go, she said. Not happening, babe. Listen, Katrina, here's the thing. Heather really likes you. She shrugged. Well, of course I'm totally awesome and very likable, lovable, some might even say, but she's already lost her mother. She's probably going to lose her father too, and you're leaving in a few weeks and you've only been here a few days, and she's latched onto you like a barnacle. Katrina grimaced. You're right about this, you're wrong about everything else in the universe. Of course I know it's not fair to let her get too close and then leave. It's a shame. I love spending time with her. She's my perfect little craftsy helper. She glanced up at him. Her father's not getting any better. Apparently not. I guess I should somehow avoid her, but I need to do it without hurting her feelings. Should I just stay in my room until after the death match? Maddox felt a sharp twist inside him. Karina was a decent enough person that she really would sit in her room by herself for the few weeks rather than hurt Heather. He shook his head. No, I'll just make sure That Heather stays on the other side of the property with one of the other families while you're here. It's best for her. Katrina nodded. I'll tell her good night and then head back to my room, she said, looking glum. Maddox paused. He couldn't believe that he was about to ask her this, but what could it hurt? Pen had been looking miserable for the past few days. Do you have any idea why the wedding was delayed? He asked quietly. Because Alexander's mother is an overbearing who constantly insults P and her family, and Alexander doesn't do jack to stop it, Katrina said, her tone heat. Then she looked at him speculatively. Maybe you could talk to him, try the angle that he's failing to protect his mate-to-be, or tell him to freaking wolf up and be a big boy. Something. Pian totally loves him except for that. Maddox nodded. If Katrina weren't the stepdaughter of his mortal enemy, he'd think that his perfect mate had walked right into the pack. She fit in with almost everyone. The pack members were already sharing confidences with her, and he had no doubt that sex with her would be the best he'd ever had. I'll deal with it, he said, his tone more curt than he intended, but he ignored the flash of hurt on her face and walked away quickly. Note to self: ask for sleeping pills tomorrow, Katrina muttered to no one at 3 a.m. She felt irritable and tired, and her fur itched under her skin, and she was ready to explode. She shifted and paced the floor. Earlier hadn't helped. She was sad that she couldn't hang out with Heather anymore, although she agreed with Maddox that it was for the best, and she was exhausted because every single night she lay awake in bed knowing that Maddox was on the other side of her wall, and sleep eluded. She thought of them lying on that soft mossy forest floor and imagined what would have happened if Maddox hadn't stopped himself. She'd have let him take her any way he wanted, from behind on all fours, anything. She'd have taken him in her mouth, tasted his cum. She heard a whistling sound, and then her window shuttled inward and exploded. A shower of glass rained inward, and she fell off the bed onto the floor. Her arms were bleeding from small cuts, and shards of glass clung to her pajamas. She plucked them off and tossed them aside. Dazed smoke. The room was full of smoke. She crawled towards the door, which flew open before she reached it. Katrina. Maddox's voice was panicked. He bent down and scooped her up in his arms. Shifters were running down the hall cursing, I'm fine, I'm fine. Her ears were ringing. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Wasn't there a guard outside my window? Go check on him. I feel panic and pain. Well, not too bad, he's not dying. He's calming down. There will be others checking on him, he growled. He ran into his room and set her down on his bed. A big oak 4-poster Carver stuck his head in the door. Maddox, you okay? He yelled. Go get the healer, Maddox called out. I'm fine. He turned his attention back to Katrina. What happened? It sounded like someone shot a grenade into your room using a grenade launcher. I'm not a weapons expert, but that sounds about right. She shook her head, ringing ears. Oh crud, I'm bleeding on your bedspread. He waved a hand in dismissal. It's not a problem. A minute later the pack's healer Robin rushed in. All right, we'll have you fixed up in no time. She sat next to Katrina and put her hand on her and closed her eyes. Katrina felt the pain begin to fade. Her cut sealed up, and within a minute she was healed and her ears had stopped ringing. I'm fine. That was perfect, Katrina said. Robin was slightly pale, but not too bad. Katrina's wounds hadn't drained too much power because they were minor. She nodded at Katrina and hurried out of the room. Maddox ran his hands over her arms, sending a little shiver through her. You're all right now? She nodded. Then I'm going to find out who did this and rip their head off with my bare hands. He called Michael in to watch her and headed out. He was back in about 2 hours, looking frustrated. He waved Michael off and settled down on the bed next to Katrina with a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. No luck, she said. He shook his head in exasperation. I really thought that Lula was behind this, but I had my men watching her all night. She went for a Stroll by herself went into the woods. She was far away when this attack happened. We found the grenade launcher. It had actually been taken from our armory opposite end of the property from where Lula was. No centium all over it again. Thank God the grenade was a dud. First someone tries to bust me out of here, then someone tries to kill me. You're right, Lula sounds like the most likely candidate for both of those incidents. Katrina heaved a sigh and looked around the room. Deer head with antlers mounted on the wall, heavy rough oak furniture, a woven Navajo-style rug on the broad oak planked floor. Whoa, she said, what, you going to insult my taste in decorating? Bring it. Maddox had that maddening grin again. I'll try to take it like a man. No, not that. You and I, we're alone in a room together. I'm sitting on a bed next to you. Did you ever think you'd see the day? Can't say I anticipated this happy accident. His voice was husky and his breathing was quick. I can't go back to my room. Her voice was small. Desire sizzled through her body and she felt slightly dizzy. There's glass on my bed. Nope, that's true, and it seems like your room is a dangerous place these days. You'll just have to sleep here. You think we can keep our hands off each other given the unfortunate? He moved closer to her. He was sitting right next to her, pressed up against her. Given the unfortunate fact that our wolves are very attracted to each other. Blame it on her animal nature, she thought, because there was nothing rational about it. No, I'm sure we can't see. He ran his fingers along her arm and she whimpered, not even trying to hide it. This is a bad idea, isn't it? She twisted around so she was facing him. Terrible, and so is this. He bent down and kissed her, his soft warm mouth claiming hers. Chapter N9. Heat climbed into her cheeks and raced south to her, suddenly tingling. Maddox was dressed in only a pair of jeans which he presumably pulled on in haste when he heard the blast. His naked chest was burning hot and he pressed against her so that she could feel his heart hammering. Her pulse was racing too. He explored her mouth slowly, tentatively, almost as if despite his Allah nature he was unsure of her response, and she could understand that this was crazy. He was kissing the stepdaughter of a rival Alpha who had just issued him with a death challenge, but the strength of his hands as he cradled her face between them and the firmness of his muscular chest pressed against her breasts spoke of his strength. Slowly, unable to resist, she wound her arms around his neck, curling her fingers into the soft hair at the nape of his neck. He took a ragged breath and suddenly he was bearing down onto the bed, kissing her with wild ferocity as if her unspoken acceptance had snapped the thread of his control. His tongue tangled with hers and he bit the side of her throat, drawing a gasp from her as he ran his big palm up to her breast and tweaked her nipple between his fingers. A thread of arousal ran from her nipple to her clitoris and she mewed into his mouth frantically. He pulled at her pajama top, groaning with impatience when she broke their kiss and brushed his hands away so she could deftly undo the buttons. His eyes were feral with need, half-lied, and his lips were parted. A flush of color stained his high cheekbones. He growled when she exposed her breasts and drew her into his arms, nipping at her lower lip and working his hips against her. She could feel the needy length of him against her even through her pajamas and the thick denim of his jean, and she blushed again as a gush of moisture soaked the flimsy cotton and the scent of her own arousal reached her nostrils. Maddox nipped at her throat again, then worked his way down her body, trailing his lips over her collarbone before drawing one peaked nipple into his mouth and suckling on it. His hand cued her other breast, traced the curve of her waist and worked its way lower to finger the sodden material of her pajamas. She gave an undignified yelp which turned into a long low moan when he began to rub her with his fingers in slow smooth circles. He tore his mouth away from hers for a moment, still circling his fingers, then stilled with a shudder of effort. You want this? It wasn't a question, nor was it a statement. It was a plea and the heady sense of power that washed over Katrina had her heart racing and her clenching against his fingers. The biggest baddest alpha on the block didn't just want her, he was begging her to want him too. Beyond words she squeezed her thighs around his hand, rolling her hips, and a look of primal satisfaction washed over his features, satisfaction tinged with relief. Then he was working his way down, kissing her belly, running his hands over her hips and thighs. He dipped his fingers beneath the waistband of her pajama bottoms and whisked them over her hips, leaving her naked and exposed to the cool night air. Katrina parted her thighs further as she felt his hot breath against the slick swollen flesh of her __. She trembled with anticipation, but only for a moment before his mouth descended and he sucked on her, not letting up even when her hips arched up from the bed and she clutched handfuls of his long brown hair, crying out as the sensations built into a maelstrom of throbbing, shivering need that had her teetering on the brink of orgasm. He withdrew teasingly and placed sticky kisses on the insides of her thighs. Katrina whimpered, then moaned as he drew his tongue up the length of her slit, lapping up her juices. She thrashed her head back and forth on the pillow, unable even to beg, as waves of sensation washed up and down her body. He flicked her rapidly with his tongue, delicate fluttering motions that pushed her into an orgasm so fierce and intense that she almost howled with pleasure, writhing against his eager mouth as he gave a low growl of primal satisfaction. She was still spasming, still gasping for breath and control, when he positioned himself between her thighs, holding himself above her with one hand while he slid the head of his against her slippery entrance with the other. She gasped as he pushed inside. There was no hesitation, just one smooth, confident movement that had him lodged fully inside her as her greedily clutched at him, squeezing him like a fist. With the aftershocks of her orgasm he froze above her, squeezing, his eyes closed and giving a long groan. The expression on his face was halfway between bliss and pain. He stayed still inside her for long moments, his chest heaving with his labored breaths. He rhythmically clenched and unclenched his fists, his biceps swelling as he struggled for control. Katrina, feeling wicked, nipped his flat nipple between her teeth. Then, when he yelped with shock, caught him off guard with a slow, deliberate flex of her hips. His eyes went wolf and he thrust into her desperately, furiously, shuddering and working his hips. She wrapped her arms around him, digging her fingernails into his back as the sensations built inside her again. The skin of his back was sweat slick under her fingers, the muscles flexing smoothly as he pistoned into her. Her legs trembled and she parted her thighs as far as she could, then wrapped her legs around his waist, wanting to get closer to him. Feeling as if she could never get close enough, she threw her head back, closing her eyes and allowing her lips to part on a prolonged whimper of need, and he nuzzled against her, hiding his face in the crook of her neck as the orgasm roared through her and she clutched his muscular buttocks, urging him to go faster, deeper. His howl of completion was muffled against her throat, and the pulsing of his set off a cascade of tumbling orgasms that left her writhing, blind and mindless with arousal and desire. It took long moments before she drifted back to herself. Maddox lay heavily on top of her, his face still pressed against her throat, his breath shuddering unevenly. His was still half hard inside her. Her thighs were sticky with her excitement and his come. No wonder Lula was so desperate to Alpha. Of course, this particular Alpha was a sworn enemy of her stepfather's pack, and less than a month from now one of them was going to die. Her heart lurched and suddenly she was overcome by a feeling of low dread. She didn't know whether she was worried that Maddox might win or terrified that he might lose. Chapter 10. All right, time to get this out of his system. Carver stood in the parking lot outside the Bitter Brew. Bambi had called him because she was bored and needed distraction, and apparently none of her other guys were available this afternoon. Today they weren't even going to go through the motions of hanging out at the bar. First they were going to take their lunch break at her place and then he'd head back to pack property. He had to admit he was just about ready to move on. He'd only seen Bambi for this long because she was always available. She wasn't a member of his pack and she didn't live on their grounds, made it easier to keep it casual. Growing up with a father who cheated constantly and finally walked out on his family when Carver was 10 had made him question whether he even had it in him to have a real relationship. It didn't seem to run in the genes. On the bright side, all of those schoolyard taunts from his classmates and the fights that resulted had ensured that he toughened up very young. He scanned the parking lot looking for any sign of any Mars pack members. So far he didn't see anyone. He'd stationed a number of his men in town and the residents of Greenville would notify them if they saw anyone. There was no love lost between the townspeople and the Morthouse pack these days. "There you are, sweetie pie," Bambi trilled, hurrying eagerly towards him. He was having a hard time dredging up any excitement at all at the prospect of this afternoon's bedtime activities. He realized as she strolled towards him. He heard another voice call out, "Oh hi honey." It was the stunning BR from the other day. She just popped out from behind a Volvo parked in the lot. What the hell? She threw her arms around him. "I am so sorry about our little lover's quarrel the other day," she said. He turned to Bambi, trying to push the brunette away. "Bambi, I swear to God I have no idea who." The brunette pressed her full lips up against his and kissed him. To his shock he found himself responding. Oh dear God, was he responding? His swelled in his pants and he reached down and gripped her hair and plunged his tongue into her mouth, exploring the sweet silky cave with increasing furor. "You son of a," Bambi screamed, "didn't even know her. We are through, you bastard." He pulled away to see Bambi storming off. Bewildered, he looked down at the stunning brunette. "Listen beautiful, I know you think we know each other." Ouch. She kneed him in the groin incredibly hard and he doubled over in pain. "That's for Katrina, you cowardly bunch of kidnappers grabbing a helpless woman, and if you mangy mutts hurt her I will personally come back and chew your face off." She leaped into the Volvo and took off with a screech of tires. Screw that. He jumped in his Jeep and took off after her, calling Maddox to let him know what he was doing. "She seems to be heading out of town," he told him. "And you're positive she's not a Morehouse member?" "Oh, I'd remember this woman. Believe me." "You want me to send backup?" Carver burst out laughing. "Sir, the day I can't handle a 5'5" schwolf is the day I hand in my badge as pack enforcer." "Yep, sounds like you've done a great job with her so far," Maddox said, and he hung up. Carver scowled at that. Very funny. Unfortunately, since Maddox was the alpha, he was the one person that Carver could not possibly suggest should take a flying leap onto a giant dick. Not if he wanted to keep his jugular intact. He concentrated on the road ahead. She kept driving and driving, zipping around curves, foot on the accelerator. He matched her speed easily, following her through human territory and out again until a couple of hours later they were in Timber Valley. As they crossed the county line, a half-dozen cars pulled out from the side of the road and surrounded him and forced him to a halt. Two of them were patrol cars. He climbed out of his car, watching the beautiful brunette leap out of her car and slam the door within seconds. 6 male wolf shifters were barreling down on him. He pulled out his badge and held it up. They glanced at it suspiciously as they stopped and stood side by side, still bristling and defensive. "Carver Lawrence, enforcer for the Killingworth Peak," Carver said. He glanced at Virginia, who was shooting him murderous looks. "I take it this she-devil is one of yours?" An older man with streaks of gray in his hair stepped forward. Despite his years, he was in perfect physical Shape barrel-chested and muscular with a dominating air, clearly alpha. Vince Battle Carver was pretty sure from various statewide shifter gatherings he'd attended over the years. Vince Battle Alpha of the Battle Pack, I expect you've got a really good reason for following my daughter into our territory. His voice was a menacing growl, his dark eyes blazing with anger. The brunette strolled up to stand next to her father, hands shoved in her pockets. Carver met Vince's gaze and didn't show a trace of submission. He didn't bow down to anyone but his own alpha. He'd been told quite often that he could easily be alpha of his own pack. He was just barely beta. Sometimes he went over the line. I expect your daughter's got a really good reason for coming into our territory and physically assaulting me twice, despite the fact that I've never met her before. Something about Katrina. He raised an eyebrow and shot her a look. Vince sucked in an angry breath. He turned to shoot an angry look at his daughter Virginia. She lifted her chin defiantly. They kidnapped her when she went into town to go shoe shopping. It's outrageous. We should be rescuing her. She's my cousin, and for God's sake, we have discussed this. They did not violate the covenant. This is an issue between two packs. She is not in danger, and the Killingworth pack does not have the reputation of abusing females or breaking the law. She put her hands on her hips. What would you do if it had happened to me? You just sit there and let me be kidnapped. We know you'd go all alpha and declare pack war. We're not having this conversation here. You're grounded. Virginia threw back her head and laughed, but there was a harsh edge to it. I am 20. You cannot ground me as your father and your alpha. I damned well can. You just added another month to your grounding, then I will move off pack property. I am an adult and you cannot continue treating me like a child. Her eyes glittered with anger. So you're an adult, but you come into my territory to harass me and then go running back to call for help and hide behind daddy like a 5-year-old, Carver said scornfully. She was a spoiled little daddy's girl and a total brat. She was also incredibly hot, and she turned him on like nothing he'd ever experienced before. But at the moment all he wanted to do was throw her over his knee and spank her. To his surprise she nodded. You're right. Next time I'll handle the consequences on my own. There won't be a next time, Vince shouted, his face flushing with anger. You all have a good day now. Carver turned and walked back to his car without looking back, climbed in and slammed the door. He backed up, made a U-turn and headed back towards Greenville. The sunrise painted a red and orange glow along the horizon, and the high jagged mountain were outlined against the sky. The pack was up early as ever. Maddox and Katrina stood on the front porch of the common house sipping coffee and watching the morning mist swirl on the ground. Soon the sun's rays would burn the mists away and chase the mild chill from the air. Wow, we still haven't gotten it out of our system. I thought maybe we'd be sick of each other by now. Katrina shook her head in amazement. It had been a week of the best, most earth-shatteringly delicious sex she'd ever had. A week of waking up wrung out and sweaty in Maddox's arms, breathing him in and feeling his heartbeat against her chest and wishing it could last forever. Maddox winked at her. We'll have to try harder, she scoffed. I may need a day off just to recuperate. At his stricken look she added quickly, oh, there are other things that we can do. It's fun to get creative. He slung his arm around her shoulder and she started. What? He said, looking puzzled. Everybody can see us, you me the enemy. Together. Maddox threw back his head and laughed heartily. Sweetheart, you know that every wolf pack is like a high school full of teenaged girls when it comes to gossip, right? Everybody knows and they're fine with it. She stared up at him. Are you fine with it? If you are now. His expression turned serious with maybe the faintest hint of worry. She bit her lip. The death challenge was getting closer and closer. Is there any way that you'd consider seeking an alliance with my stepfather? She finally asked him. He might be open to it. It's worth a shot. He Sighed, it's not possible. Even if he would agree to it I wouldn't. I'm sorry, your two packs would be stronger together. For me to form an alliance with someone I have to be willing to defend them and their actions and stand behind them. I cannot defend or even tolerate your stepfather's actions. She nodded. She wished she could talk to Maddox about whatever the hell was going on with the Gophers and with everyone in town for that matter, but that would be betraying her own pack. It sucked not being able to confide in him. The more time that she spent with him, the more she felt like they were melding together like two halves of a whole. Across the common area she saw Peony and Alexander walking hand in hand. They were smiling. Peony caught her eye and gave her a happy wave. Hello, check that out, she said. Yep, I had a few words with Alexander and his mother. Both his mother won't be moving in next to them. I let them know that I personally was forbidding it for the sake of pack harmony, which took some of the responsibility off Alexander, and Alexander actually stood up to her. Well, pray praise the Lord and pass the pudding, it's a miracle. He laughed. See, I do have my uses. Her tone turned lascivious. Plenty of uses, really. Would you like to use me right now? She wanted to, but she couldn't let this death match thing go. It was nagging at her like a sharp splinter. She couldn't quite reach Maddox. You do realize, and I am not questioning your abilities as an alpha. I'm being completely respectful for once. Enjoy it while it lasts, which will be about 60 seconds. That it is possible that my stepfather could win. He has not lost a single death challenge ever, neither have I, and I will win. He met her gaze and he'd gone dead serious. Believe me when I tell you that I'm very good. There's a lot that I'm fighting for. I won't lose. She could tell what he meant. Her. He was fighting for her, not just for his pack but her. He's up to something, she blurted out. There had to be some reason why he set the death match in a month. I'm sure he is. That's your stepfather's nature. For once she didn't lash out and defend the honor of her pack. Maddox was right. She knew it, and she'd probably sensed it on some level for a long time, but loyalty to her pack had prevented her from acknowledging it to herself. He'll find a way to cheat. Maddox shook his head. He can try. You know how much the Council of Elders has tightened the scrutiny on the death challenges. There had been a terrible cheating scandal a couple of years back when it turned out that one of the officials who oversaw the death challenges was actually being blackmailed by an alpha. The official had pretended that the alpha tested clear of magic enhancement, but the alpha was doping himself so he could win. The cheater and the official had both been put to death. Now an entire 5-person panel did the testing. There would be no magic, no steroids, no drugs. No way that Roman could cheat. I thought I saw him moving a little stiffly a while back. Katrina ventured by telling Maddox that she was stepping so far over into pack treason territory that there was no going back. It had occurred to me that he might have some kind of injury and he was giving it time to heal properly. Maddox didn't look at all concerned, although his healer really should be able to take care of most injuries anyway. It won't help, she sighed. She dreaded the challenge and desperately wanted it to be over with at the same time. Listen, if you want, and this is not what I want at all, but I'm telling you that I'd understand if you want to move back to your room and wait until after the fight. I'd understand. Maddox's voice was pained as he said it, and he tensed, waiting for her answer. Katrina considered it. If she had any common sense, that's what she'd do. Then again, if she had any common sense, she would have resisted her overwhelming burning attraction for Maddox. What kind of repercussions would there be for her if Maddox lost? She sighed and considered it to be away from Maddox to wake up to an empty bed. I'll stay with you, she said, and she felt the tension flow out of Maddox's body. He bent down and swept her in his arms and kissed her passionately, a kiss that was hot and hungry, his tongue probing deeply. She whimpered, into his mouth and melted up against him. Her heart thudded in her chest and her knees went weak and wobbly. When he finally released her, he looked down at her with a wide satisfied grin. In case there was anyone on the entire property who didn't know, I'm pretty sure they're all clear now, and if you'll excuse me, I've got to brush up on my ass-kicking skills, so I'm off to the training center. I pity that poor punching bag. Katrina headed back inside to take a shower, and as she walked down the hall, she passed Carver. "Hey, I saw your cousin Virginia the other day," he said. Katrina raised an eyebrow. "Really? How did that go?" Violently. Carver had a half-baffled, half-amused look on his face. "She's got some quick reflexes, that girl." Katrina threw back her head and laughed. That sounded about right for Virginia, who was probably thoroughly cheesed off about Katrina's abduction. "Serves you right. Where did you meet her?" she asked. Katrina didn't see Virginia that often since she lived 2 hours away. "She came to town to inquire after your welfare, shall we say. She must give her boyfriend absolute hell." "She doesn't have one," Katrina said as she headed off to her room, and she was already getting ready for her shower when she suddenly realized that Carver had said that because he was fishing to find out if Virginia was single. Later that day, Teresa approached her in the kitchen at the rec center as she rolled out PIO for homemade apple pies they'd be making later. "I hate to say I told you so, but no, I don't," Teresa said, smiling as he asked, "You yet?" "Who asked me what?" Teresa glanced around and lowered her voice. "You know Maddox to marry him, to be his mate." "Oh good God, no." Katrina actually found herself blushing as she rolled the dough out. "It's hardly the time for that. I mean, well, death challenge and all that fun stuff coming up." "Oh well, after he wins, I'm sure he'll ask you," Teresa said confidently. Katrina could only pray that Teresa was right about winning at least, and if she was being honest with herself about the rest of it too. The longer she'd come to stay with Maddox, the more she'd realized that she'd grown up with a false image of him and his pack. Most of his pack were decent, just like most of her pack was decent. Maddox was known as a strong alpha and a harsh disciplinarian, but she'd never seen him behave like the brutal, abusive bully that her parents had described. Violet wondered by holding a rolling pin and looking confused. "What am I supposed to be doing again?" she asked Katrina. "You came to help me roll some dough, remember?" Katrina moved out of the way for her. "Oh yes, now I remember. We're making pie for your baby show. What are you and Maddox going to name her?" Violet settled in next to her and dumped some flour on her rolling pin. "Oh, still thinking of names," Katrina said, blushing again. Violet sure was eager to have her start pumping out those cubs. "I don't remember your wedding at all," Violet confided in her. "I must have been thoroughly sauced. Shame on me." She let out a demure titter, hiding it behind her hand. "See, Miss Violet called it from the beginning," Teresa said, winking at her. "She knew Maddox was sweet on you." Speaking of Maddox, Teresa looked through the big picture window. Maddox was striding towards the kitchen and he didn't look happy. "What?" Katrina said as soon as he walked in the door. "What's happened?" "Heather's father hit tree while drunk last night. Didn't survive." There were exclamations of dismay throughout the room. "Oh." Katrina went pale. She felt mingled pity and fury for Heather's father. Of course he was heartbroken. She got that now that she'd started to have real feelings for Maddox. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose a mate, but how could he abandon a perfect little girl like Heather? "Let's talk about this outside," he said. Katrina followed him outdoors. "Heather's asking for you." He said they'd still kept Heather with a family on the far end of the Pack property and Katrina hadn't seen her again. "What should I do?" she blinked back. "Tears. This sucks. It's horrible. I'm furious at him, no matter how sad I am for him. Damn it, I want to punch someone." "I was going to wait to ask you this," but he took a deep breath and grabbed her hand. "I need to know if you're going to stay here permanently." Her heart leaped in her Chest, you're asking me, I want you to stay here, everyone wants you to stay here, I want you with me in my room, our room, well we'd move into our own house of course, damn it I'm not good at this. Katrina managed a shaky laugh. No you're not, what I'm doing is proposing, not just because of Heather, because I want you by my side for the rest of my life and I want to have lots of beautiful cubs with you. We better hope they take after their mother then. Hey, Maddox pretended to look injured. I am a very handsome man, my mother told me so. She wore glasses, right? Katrina threw her arms around him. Yes, I accept if you come up with a more romantic proposal after the death match. The answer will be odds are pretty good. If I were a betting person I'd place all my money on yes. His grin was so huge it looked as if his face was going to split in two. I'd be jumping up and down with joy and celebrating if we didn't have to go talk to Heather right now. It was a long tear-filled day and Heather fell asleep in Katrina's arms. They moved her to the main house along with Caroline, who was her aunt on her mother's side, and did their best to keep her busy during the days that followed. Chapter 11. Katrina strolled through the woods, struggling to keep the nagging worry inside her at bay. 2 more days, then this would finally be over. She kept telling herself that as long as it was a fair fight, Maddox was sure to win. The problem was she knew that her stepfather didn't fight fair. Despite the fact that she and Maddox were together, she still had security trailing after her, partly because of the attack on her from earlier that month. She didn't bother to object, it wouldn't have changed Maddox's mind, and she understood that he had to make sure that she stayed on the property. Losing a hostage would mean losing respect and appearing weak. I need to find some more daisies for Heather's hair and then we can go back, she told Michael. Suit yourself, he shrugged. Nice day, I'm in no hurry. She spotted a clump of daisies, knelt down to pick them, and as she did she scented Lula in the area. Whatever, she and Lula couldn't avoid each other forever now that she was going to be living here. She grabbed the daisies. As she brushed ants off them, she called out to Michael, hey, I'm ready to head back. Her only answer was a thud on the ground, the sound of a body falling. She shot to her feet. Lula was standing 5 feet away holding a tran gun. Michael lay sprawled out on the ground unconscious. You crazy? Katrina hurried towards him. If you killed him, he's fine. Tranquilizer. Lula usually looked pretty intense, but she really had the crazy eyes today. Let's get you out of here, we're going to shift and run for it. I have a car parked on one of our side roads and you can duck down under some blankets I've got there so we can get off the property, but we've got to hurry. Going anywhere with Lula, especially when she was holding a gun, seemed like a very bad idea. Why would you help me? She asked suspiciously. Because as soon as you're gone I can reclaim my alpha for good. Lula's eyes gleamed with a crazy light. He'll think he's broken hearted and I'll be there to comfort him. The thought of Lula with Maddox made her so angry that she had to fight to keep her wolf down. How do I know you won't try to kill me? She demanded. Lula's face fell. If I did, Maddox would find out who killed you and he'd never forgive me. Otherwise, believe me, I would. You put cyanide in those TRS before you would have killed your own packmates. Lula sneered. No, you would have, and Maddox would have hated you for it. Katrina was horrified. She couldn't believe how far Lula was willing to go to try to trap a man who clearly wasn't interested in her. Maddox needed to know how crazy and dangerous Lula was, and Heather needed her here. She couldn't handle another abandonment, and Katrina couldn't bear the thought of leaving Maddox. Let her go, Lula snapped, gesturing impatiently with her gun. Unless you want to be known as a traitor to your own pack in 2 days, that won't be an issue. And no, I'm not going. She turned to run back to the compound and felt a sharp sting between her shoulder blades. Fine, we do it the hard way. Those were the last words she heard before the world faded away from her. She woke up inside a car trunk bumping down the road. It was Dark and stuffy and her head hurt. How the hell did Lula think that she could get away with this? She wondered furiously, and what was she even planning? She could hardly drive up to the Morehouse Pack's front door and deliver her, or would she? Lula might be that crazy. She fumbled around inside of the car. The cable released for the car trunk latch should be there somewhere. Her father had taught her that trick. Her mother had hated how her father taught her self-defense and lock-picking and all those other skills that were horrifyingly unladylike. Her father had insisted that an alpha's daughter always needed to be able to take care of herself. She kept fumbling until she found the cable, yanked it, and the trunk popped open. She quickly shifted and leaped out of the car. She hit the asphalt with a painful thud, rolling over several times before scrambling to her feet. She could feel her sides and shoulder aching, but she shook it off. She heard the car screech to a stop, looked up ahead, and to her shock saw Teresa climbing out of the car. Lula and Teresa working together. Teresa had been pushing her to get together with Maddox from the beginning, and now she was kidnapping her. She didn't have time to try to figure it out. She just needed to get back to the Killingworth grounds and warn Maddox. He'd sort it all out. She shot into the woods. She doubted Teresa would try to follow her. Katrina could take her out. As she ran, she realized she was near the Gophers' territory. This was her chance. If she found one of the Gophers, she could ask them what the hell was going on with her stepfather, and then she could bring that information back to Maddox as well. She quickly came up to a giant barbed wire fence and halted, surprised. It looked as if it ran on and on. She'd never seen that fence there before. Her stepfather's doing, she was sure. Far off in the distance she could see a wolf pacing by the barbed wire. He was a wolf who'd come over with her stepfather when he'd taken over her pack. Her stepfather's men were guarding the property from what it wasn't even his property. Suddenly, deep inside her, she started to feel panic and fear swelling up. Somebody know lots of people were terrified and trapped. For her to sense the emotions, it had to be people who she'd met before. She was betting on the Gophers. She'd be taking a risk by staying here, but she couldn't run away from the fear. She needed to help, needed to find the people. The need welled up inside her, nearly choking her. She quickly began pawing at the ground, and within a few minutes had made enough of a hole to wriggle under it. She raced away from the wolf who was patrolling, and realized she was running away from the source of the fear and panic. She forced herself to keep going. She'd find a way to circle back around. She couldn't let him spot her. She was heading towards the Gophers' home area, where most of their houses were gathered around a common area similar to a pack. Somebody was hurrying through the woods. Stacy. She dashed over, quickly shifted and called out to her. Stacy swung around and stared back, looking terrified. "You've got to get out of here. He'll kill them," she pleaded, her head swiveling around as she frantically scanned the forest. "Kill who? What are you talking about?" "Katrina, Amanda, our families." Her friend was thin and pale and had dark circles under her eyes. "Stacy, please, I know everyone seems to think that I know what Roman's up to, but I swear on my late father's honor that I do not. Roman keeps us all far away from here, miles away from here, and he said it's because of all the construction." Stacy spoke in lowered tones, still looking around her as if expecting Roman to pop out from behind a tree. "He'd kill me himself if he knew I was talking to you. There aren't any of his men near us right now. I'd sent them." Stacy briefly met her gaze, chewing her lip. "A year ago he took over our property. He sells our timber off our land. He's got us working around the clock for him for nothing. He's holding our families, the older Gophers and the young ones who can't work hard enough, prisoner. He moves them to different hiding spots every few days." "But I saw you in town," Katrina protested. "He sends some of us in from time to time so nobody will know." Anything's wrong, but he always has one of his men with us. Her eyes glittered with tears. It feels like it will never end. It feels like we'll die like this. I haven't seen my parents in weeks. I don't know if they're alive. Katrina thought she might vomit. This was horrifying, and it had happened on her property right under her nose. Dear God, I am so sorry. I swear to you I didn't know. I would never have stood for this. I believe you. Stacy's voice was dull and hopeless. I can sense where your families are, because I picked up on their feelings, she said. That's why Roman wouldn't let me anywhere near here. I would have sensed it. They're about a quarter of a mile northwest of here. She pointed. Did we can get Maddox and he will make sure they're rescued. Then we can report my stepfather to the council. She felt relief wash over her. If her stepfather were in trouble with the council, maybe the death challenge wouldn't need to happen. You really think so? Stacy asked anxiously. I know so. I've been staying with him almost a month now. I know what he's like. He'd never put up with this if he knew. Do you have a phone with you? We can call him right now. Stacy shook her head. None of us are allowed phones here. Your stepfather's afraid we'll call and alert somebody. She leaned in furtively. We managed to stash a few phones. I can get to one, but it might be a little later today. I have to report back to the construction site. They just sent me to deliver a message to a construction foreman, and I've already taken too long. Katrina froze, tipped her head back and sniffed the air. Wolf, I smell wolf. One of my stepfather's nephews. I've got to go before I'm spotted. Tell Maddox that I told you. Teresa and Lula are traitors and they're collaborating. She recited Maddox's number to Stacy and made her recite it back 3 times, and then she shifted and ran. She found the same spot that she dug under earlier and wriggled back through dirt clumped in her fur, and she shook it off as she ran. When she reached the main road, she hesitated as she saw a car heading towards her. She scented, yes, it was Ray's from her pack distant cousin on her father's side. She stepped out into the road and waved frantically at him. She needed to call her mother to tell her what was happening and alert her to get off the property. She didn't want her mother there. When the elders sent in the wardens, her mother might end up getting arrested right along with him, and who knows how long she'd be in jail before everything was straightened out. She ran out into the road and waved at him. He pulled over quickly. Katrina, what are you doing here? You escaped. Geez, we thought you'd never get out of there. Hold on a minute. He climbed out, shed his denim jacket and handed it to her. She quickly put it on. She wasn't cold, but there was no need to stand around naked. Fortunately, he was a big guy. The jacket went down mid-thigh. He started to talk, but she held up her hand. Reese, I need to borrow your cell phone. Actually, I need to keep it for now because I need to make a few phone calls, she said. Just head on back to the pack property and I'll get it to you later, but I can give you a ride. He looked confused as he dug in his pocket, pulled out his phone and handed it to her. Aren't you coming with me? The Killing War pack might find you out here. She hesitated for a minute. Could she trust him? She truly didn't know who in her pack knew about the Gophers and whatever else Roman had been up to. Right now she couldn't risk it. I need you to go, she said. I am going to have someone pick me up. I'll be fine. Roman's probably going to be pretty pissed if I just leave you here. Reyes looked worried. Tell him you asked me to go with you and I refused. He knows how stubborn I am. All right, I guess. With a worried glance back at her, he climbed in the truck and drove off. She quickly dialed her mother. Mother, just listen, she said. The moment her mother answered, is Roman with you? I need to talk to you alone. No, he's not here. Where are you? Katrina headed to the other side of the road and into the woods as she talked back in the direction of the Killingworth pack. She had a good 7 or 8 miles to go from here, and she didn't want to risk any of the Morehouse pack driving by right now. She quickly filled her mother in on what she'd found. So you need to get off the property right now. You should probably go consult a lawyer so you don't end up letting Roman drag you down with him." After a long pause her mother said, "Well, they're not wolves, are they? They're only gophers." Katrina gasped. "You are serious? You are okay with him enslaving and abusing a peaceful group of shifters? Wolves against gophers? That's disgusting. The pack is the most important thing. The pack always comes first, and this has enriched us considerably. The honor of the pack is the most important thing," Katrina said heatedly. Then she reached for the only thing that her mother cared about, their reputation. "People in town are already starting to catch on. When everybody finds out about this, our pack will universally be loathed, and other packs may very well come to the rescue of the gophers out of principle." "I suppose." Her mother didn't sound convinced. "Maybe not, though. Your stepfather's going to be a lot more powerful soon. He's got some great plans." She lowered her voice. "He's going to be one of the elders." "How? The elders are a lifetime position," Katrina protested. "Well, things happen, you know, and he's positioning himself in such a way that should one of their seats become empty, he will be popular enough that he'll have an extra shot. And with all those charity balls that we've been giving, people may not even believe it about the gophers. We can say they signed a contract with us and now they're trying to get out of it." Katrina went cold. Her stepfather's ambitions were endless. He'd somehow arrange for an elder to die and then take his place. There had been recent reforms on the Council of Elders, including allowing female pack members to choose their own mates rather than requiring their alpha's approval, and allowing pack members to leave their packs without repercussions. She knew that Roman didn't approve, and he was always talking about reversing the reforms that had been achieved. Roman in a position of power like that, it would be a nightmare. "Come back and we'll talk about it," her mother said. "We'll figure out what to do. Where are you right now?" Katrina hung up the phone. Without answering, she dialed Maddox quickly. "Where are you?" he demanded, his voice furious. "Lula claims that she saw you shoot and kill Michael." "Killed?" she cried out. Her blood ran cold. "Lula had killed him after all. Me? Lula shot him with the trans. She's the one who tried to help me escape the first time, and she put cyanide in the dart so that I'd kill people while I tried to escape, and you'd blame it on me. And Teresa's in on this somehow. Have you talked to the gophers yet?" "The gophers? What? How is Teresa in on this?" "I woke up in a car trunk and she was driving the car," she said hurriedly. "Listen, I don't have time to talk. I'm headed back to the property and I'll explain everything when I get there." She hung up before he could say anything else, dropped the phone and shifted. Then she ran. Would he even want her back? He sounded enraged when he'd answered the phone. Was he angry at her because he believed Lula, or angry because of what had happened? Michael was dead. Michael was dead. She wished she could shift a human form and cry. She wished she could howl, but she didn't dare make any noise. She just kept running. A few minutes later the wind shifted and she realized that she smelled several of her pack mates nearby and getting closer. Her mother had sold her out. She picked up speed, frantic, but within minutes they were on her and she was around it. She stopped, panting for breath, and shifted. Her stepfather's nephews Dakeson and Tor were there, and a couple of other pack mates who'd come over with her stepfather. No one from the Morehouse's original pack. "What the hell do you want?" she demanded angrily. "How dare you chase me down? I have the right to run wherever I want." "Your mother wants to talk to you," Dakeson said, looking contemptuous. He'd carried a cell phone in his jaws and dropped it on the ground. When he shifted, he picked it up and dialed while Katrina stood with her arms folded, glaring at them. They had absolutely no right to keep her here. Then again, they had no right to imprison the gophers and steal from them and enslave them. Obviously they weren't too concerned with the finer points of the covenant. Dakeson handed her the phone. "I want you to know this is for Your own good, her mother said in her haughtiest tone. Your stepfather has picked out a very nice alpha that she'll be mated with, a man with an excellent bloodline and a very good reputation. You have been carrying on with the enemy in a disgusting and disgraceful fashion. Clearly you need to be taken in hand and shown some discipline before your terrible behavior becomes public. Now I'll have you know. Katrina spit out a curse word as she turned and hurled the phone against a tree, and it shattered. Dixon cuffed her on the side of the head so hard that her ears rang. That's from your stepfather, he snarled. He said to do more than that if you gave us any trouble, and there's plenty more where that came from. Chapter 12. Maddox summoned every bit of his strength to keep his rage under control. Roman had called him up and told him if he wanted to see Katrina alive again he'd meet him at City Hall in Greensville without making any phone calls to the Council of Elders. He claimed that if Maddox made any calls he'd know. Maddox had decided not to risk it. He'd arrived first and was pacing the floor when Roman walked into the meeting room alone carrying a laptop and shut the door behind him. There's no reason I shouldn't tear your head off right now, Maddox snarled, letting his fur sprout on his face. And by the way, even though you're trying to hide it, I see you're favoring your left side. Was it the silver knife? Because I've done some checking and I've heard about the assassination attempt. You're so clever. Roman's lip curled in a sneer as he set the laptop. I think you'll want to watch this video before you make any fatal mistakes. Roman opened up his laptop and clicked on a video. It showed a horrifying video of a big gray wolf dangling from chains being skinned alive. His animal screams and pleas echoed from the laptop's speakers. A small smile twitched at Roman's lips. That was my father, Roman said proudly, after he decided that I was too weak to be an alpha and tried to drown me in the pond behind our house. I showed him who the weak one was. If you're trying to show me that you're a sick, twisted, descended from a line of sick, twisted, I already knew that. Maddox bared his fangs. He clicked off the video, then clicked on another one. This one was a live feed. Maddox struggled not to suck in his breath. Katrina sat tied to a chair. Her lip was swollen and bleeding, and she had a copper collar on her neck preventing her from shifting. A man stood next to her as Maddox watched. He cuffed Katrina on the side of her head. Katrina turned and spit blood into the man's face and snarled something that he couldn't make out. Maddox shifted and lunged, and Roman shifted too. Maddox knocked Roman to the ground easily and stood over him, his jaws snapping at Roman's neck. Roman didn't try to fight back, just lay on his back with his paws in the air. Then Roman shifted back to human form. Maddox shifted to kneeling over Roman and snarling, "Do you know how bad I'm going to hurt you before I kill you?" he growled. Roman struggled to a sitting position. "Nice fighting spirit, save it for the arena," Roman said. "You're going to need to make a good show of things before you throw the fight and let me kill you. Let's add crazy to sick, twisted. You think you can get away with kidnap Katrina? In what up world do you think I'd let that happen? I always knew you had a thing for her," Roman sneered. "You were panting after her every time you laid eyes on her." Comprehension dawned, swirling with his choking rage. "That's why you let her go shopping in town. That's why you hadn't issued an edict or reacted to my ban. You wanted me to take her hostage. I played you like the stupid pawn you are. In case you're wondering, I'm the king in this analogy." Roman's tone was loathsome. "Smog, and you decided to have the death match in a month so I'd have time to fall for her, and you sent Teresa over to spy on us. She was the one who'd been calling your pack. She let you know that Katrina and I were mating. How the did you get Lula to go along with your demented scheme?" "Teresa convinced her that she'd help get together with you. Lula had no idea that I'm going to kill you." Roman shrugged. "Teresa shot that grenade into Katrina's room. She could have killed her." "No, she couldn't. The grenade was a dud. We Just wanted to make sure Katrina would go running to you for comfort. Now I want you to think about that video you just saw. If I do that to my own father, imagine what I'd do to a SPO spiled disrespectful little that I don't even like. Maddox let out an involuntary snarl. If Roman weren't holding Katrina hostage, he'd have killed him on the spot for speaking about Katrina like that. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. He was letting Roman provoke him and showing his hand. He was letting his emotions rule his head. When we enter the death arena, you'll make a good show of fighting for the first couple of minutes, and then I will rip your throat out. I can promise you it will be quick. Then I will let Katrina live. There's an alpha that wants to marry her, and his pack would make a valuable alliance. If you fight and succeed in killing me, my family will peel the skin from Katrina's flesh, and you think her mother will let them get away with that? Maddox snarled. Roman threw back his head and let out a harsh barking laugh. It's been 3 years now, and that still hasn't produced an heir for me. Right after I kill you, I'm dumping her and marrying Teresa. She's excellent breeding stock, attractive, appropriately submissive, and she's proven that she is fertile and can give birth to sons. She'll give me alphas. Of course I'll have to kill both of her sons. She'll need to be 100% devoted to my children, but I'm sure I'll be fine with that. She won't have much choice. He stood up, closing his laptop, and walked to the door. He glanced back over his shoulder and said, "I'm sure that you'll make the right decision." Then he left the room. Maddox sat there gritting his teeth, his blood boiling. His mate was being held hostage. She was being hurt, and if he tried to rescue her, Roman's men would kill her long before he could get to her. Katrina, his feisty, beautiful, kind-hearted Katrina, was being hurt right this very minute, and he was supposed to be protecting her, and he couldn't. His mate or his pack? His mate or his pack? What would he choose? How would he choose? Chapter 13. The testing was finally complete, and both Roman and Maddox had passed the Council of Elders, were satisfied that neither of them had used any enhancements, magic or otherwise. There was a massive crowd sitting in bleachers on both sides of the field, with dozens of wardens standing by to keep order. Killingworths and their allies on one side, Mordhouse pack and their allies on the other side. The Council of Elders, of course, were sitting in front of the bleachers where they could supervise the action and ensure there was no cheating. Roman strolled onto the field waving to his pack, smiling hugely. Teresa was sitting in the front row, confident of his victory. He'd already given Janet the news of her replacement the evening before and hustled her off to a small cabin on the far edge of the property. She wept and wailed and begged in a most irritating fashion. It had been a relief to get her out of his sight. He and Teresa had celebrated all night long. It wasn't a full moon yet, so it was unlikely she'd be pregnant, but it wouldn't be long now. Oddly, she didn't look as excited as he would have expected. Did she look worried? She did. She actually looked panicked. Well, that was downright disrespectful. Maybe she wouldn't make the perfect alpha's mate after all. He felt a ripple of anger run through him. How dare she give the appearance that she thought he might lose? There were plenty of suitable replacements who were eager for the honor of being his mate. He would tolerate no disloyalty, nothing less than the adoration and respect that he was due. That was one thing he'd say for Janet. She made it clear to everyone that she worshipped the ground he trod on. That was the only acceptable demeanor for an alpha's mate. If only she'd given him an heir. Maddox threw open the flaps of the tent where he'd been undergoing his own testing and began striding across the field towards him. Roman cast a final irritated glance at Teresa and saw her gesturing frantically towards the side of the field where the Killingworth pack was sitting. There was a warden standing behind Teresa. Roman realized why was he there. Roman looked where Teresa was pointing, and a bolt of horror shot through him and made him gasp. Katrina was there, right in the Front row how she hadn't been there when he'd walked into the tent to get tested, but that had been several hours ago. Katrina blew a kiss to Maddox, then gave Roman the finger. She was sitting next to a female gopher shifter. Stay something and Stacy's parents. No, he had locked them up. How were they here? He looked at the bleachers on the other side of the field and felt sick. All of the gophers were here. All of the gophers were sitting together. That shouldn't be. He always kept the families separate. Maddox was almost on him now. This could not be happening. Everything was falling to pieces. This never happened to him. He was Roman Kaufman. Everything went his way. Wardens were standing in the bleachers next to his nephews, and his nephews looked frightened and angry. Hey old man, Maddox barked at him. Roman swiveled back to look at him, his eyes wild with panic. You know what gophers are good at? Maddox flashed a feral grin. Digging. Katrina told them where their families were, and this morning, and as soon as you left your pack property they dug a tunnel and freed them. Then they dug Katrina out with help from my men. Roman fell back a step and terror washed over him. He struggled for words, frantically tried to think of a way out, but he could only make gurgling sounds of panic. He was about to die. Now let me tell you what's about to happen, Maddox said grimly. I will kill you, and then I will hunt down and kill everyone who helped you kidnap Katrina and imprison those gopher families. Your family name will be spoken with contempt and disgust for generations to come. And you know what? Your father was right. You are weak and pathetic, and you're no alpha. I surrender, Roman said quickly, eagerly. I have money hidden. You can have all of it. Millions of dollars. You can have my pack. I'll walk away. There was no mercy in Maddox's furious gaze. Not after you kidnapped and hurt my mate and terrorized the goddamn town. You won't. Roman reeled back. He barely heard the elders stand up and make the traditional announcements, and before he knew it, Maddox had shifted and was running towards him. He was massive. His eyes were glowing with rage and his lips were wrinkled back, baring his fangs. Roman shifted quickly and panic turned and ran. He heard boos and jeering from the crowd. Coward, they screamed at him. Maddox slammed into him and tore into his back with his fangs. He felt hot searing pain and blood pouring onto his fur. Roman was pinned on the ground underneath him. He lunged upward, aiming for Maddox's throat, but his unhealed wound stiffened him and sent pain tearing through him when he moved too fast. Maddox dodged him easily. Roman managed to roll out from underneath Maddox and scramble to his feet. He backed up and Maddox advanced on him, slowly drawing the moment out. Blood coursed down Roman's back and his mind was blank with terror. He pictured his father's sneering face, heard his shouted taunts, felt the agony of his father's boots slamming into his ribs again and again. Was that his father, or was that Maddox? He let out a whimper of fear and realized he'd urinated, the stench burning his nostrils. Maddox launched himself through the air again. The last thing Roman felt was Maddox's teeth closing on his throat and then searing burning pain. Chapter 14. I thought I'd never see you again. Maddox hugged Katrina, who had already been seen by the healer. Her split lip was healed, her bruises gone, the aches faded. I knew you'd when. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. They were alone in his room and the death challenge had ended hours ago. It had been so short, it had been pretty anticlimactic. Actually, Lula had faced the ultimate penalty for killing Michael, and for her betrayal. Teresa had escaped after the game and fled, abandoning her two young sons who would be raised by their grandparents in the Morehouse pack. Despite Katrina's pleas, there was a kill on sight order for her. Katrina knew she deserved it for her treachery, but she didn't want Teresa to actually be executed. Are you sure you're okay? Maddox asked, standing back and looking over her anxiously. We can call the healer back if you need more. You're completely healed. Well, mostly. She tipped back her head and smiled at him. But you know it Might be a good idea for you to kiss me and make it better. He bent down and brushed his lips against hers and she caught her breath. Is that better? He asked. Let's start. He gave a slow feral grin that made Katrina's tingle and her toes curl. Then he swept her into his arms, snatching her up as though she weighed nothing and dumped her unceremoniously in the middle of the bed. He started stripping off his clothes, his eyes intent on her the whole time. Katrina's mouth watered as he exposed smooth golden skin. The muscles in his arms and chest flexed with every deft decisive movement, and when he pushed his jeans down over his thighs his was already erect and ready. Katrina lost no time in following suit, wriggling out of her clothes, sending bra and pant ties flying, and she was naked as she watched him stalking towards her, his expression predatory. He wore nothing but a proud possessive grin. I feel better already, she said breathlessly. Maddox crawled towards her on the bed, taking his time, and she sighed happily as he ran a hand up her calf, placed a kiss on the back of her knee. She spread her thighs and he dropped little kisses on the hot flesh as he worked his way up her body, dipped his tongue into her navel, briefly suckled on a pebbled nipple. Then he settled himself on top of her and kissed her. In contrast to the power of the man, it was soft and sweet, exploratory. His tongue fluttered against hers. He cued her face gently in his large hands. Katrina quivered with pleasure with a slow sensual burn. Then Maddox rolled them over so that she was lying on top of him and gave her that feral grin again. I've shown everyone that you're mine, he said. His gaze was intense. Katrina couldn't have looked away even if she'd wanted to. Roman the Elder's my pack every W. Now show me that I'm yours. And deep in his eyes there was the faintest flicker of uncertainty, and she understood. An alpha, a true alpha, was strong. He fought, he protected, he sacrificed, and he could never show weakness. But there was one place where he could be vulnerable, where he could trust that he wouldn't be challenged, where he could stop fighting. And that was with his mate. She kissed him. She poured everything she felt into it, love, want, wonder that he wanted her to. His lips parted on a silent sigh and she flicked her tongue against his invading teasing. She straddled him and rose above him, drinking in the sight of him. He gave a crooked smile and she gently brushed his hair away from his face. She ran her hands over the front firm planes of his chest and he gave a low whimper and allowed his eyes to drift closed when she tweaked his nipple between thumb and forefinger. The muscles of his belly twitched as she trailed her fingers over the hot flesh, and he groaned when she took his in her hand and positioned it against her slick opening. Her was already drenched from the heady sensation of power it gave her to have this man submit to her hand over his hard-won control to her. Her nipples were taut little beads of desire, and she played with one, rolling it between her thumb and finger, watching as Maddox's pupils dilated and his breathing quickened. She could tell he was desperate to plunge inside her, but he lay still, trembling slightly with want and restraint. Then achingly, slowly she sank down onto his rigid member, inch by tortuous inch. Maddox groaned long and low and clasped her hips in his hands hard enough to leave bruises. His chest rose and fell with labored effort as he struggled for control, and then he was all the way inside her, seated to the hilt. Katrina felt full, complete, her clenched around him as a wave of possessive arousal washed over her, and she began to move slowly at first until she found a rolling rhythm that built in wave after wave of electric sensation. Maddox moaned and ran his hands up to cup her breasts, kneading the soft flesh. Katrina gasped and tilted her head back, allowing the freion of pleasure to run through her from her scalp to the tips of her toes. She felt loved, powerful, like an alpha's mate. She increased her pace, her clenching as Maddox grew and began to move beneath her, thrusting in counterpoint to her movements, joining in the dance. His swollen length moved in and out of her slick folds, and a sweet pressure started to build in her belly and thighs. She whimpered at the intensity of the sensation. Then she put her hands over his heart, continuing to work her hips against him. Voice husky, she said, "You're mine, Maddox, mine." Then she leaned down and kissed him with every ounce of the passion she felt for him, claiming his lips, which opened greedily to hers. Maddox wrapped his arms around her and they tangled together, lips and limbs and The unbearably sweet, spiraling sensations of orgasm. Katrina moaned helplessly against his mouth as she came, and Maddox tumbled over the edge with her, his arms like bands of steel around her, his heart beating frantically against hers. For blissful moments she hardly knew where she ended and he began. Yours, he whispered gratefully. Yours. Epilogue. I'm going to be a flower girl. I'm going to be a flower girl. Heather twirled around her dress, billowing around her. Katrina and Maddox stood on the common enjoying the glorious autumn weather. It was September and there was a faint delicious chill in the air. Caroline and Peony and a dozen other women were gathered at the picnic table where Katrina had first met them, planning out the details of Maddox and Katrina's wedding. Peony's wedding had gone off without a hitch and now her stomach was gently swelling. Heather danced over to their tea. I'm going to be a flower girl, see me spin, she sang, spinning in circles. What is a flower girl anyway? Oh, I'm dizzy. She settled down next to P. Heather will be the best big sister ever when we have cubs, don't you think? Katrina said, squeezing Maddox's hand. Cubs? MX's eyes lit up. Do you know something that I don't? He asked hopefully. No, not yet, you goon. I think we should wait 1 year and then start doing it like bunnies on every full moon until I have a bun growing in the oven. What do you think? I think I love you. He pulled her to him. You think? She punched his arm. I know I love you, you crazy she-wolf. You should. I'm incredible. She glanced at the women gathered around the table and let out a sigh. I do wish my father were alive to walk me down the aisle. For that matter, I wish my mother hadn't stabbed me in the back to the point where I don't even want to talk to her. She's still moaning about the utter disgrace of me not allowing her at our wedding. You were generous to have spared her life. Maddox scowled. Katrina shuddered. I could never have ordered her killed. Frankly, the social disgrace is punishment enough. All of her friends were just like her, a bunch of shallow image-obsessed social climbers. And now that the truth came out about Roman, she's been ostracized. Serves her right, but let's concentrate on the good stuff. Heather's safe and happy. Our packs are starting to actually talk to each other and I'm going to marry the most beautiful wolf in the world. He flashed a wicked grin at her. Hey, I have an idea. What's your idea? He leaned down and nipped her ear. How about we go back to our room and play a little game of hostage and captive? I like your ideas, Katrina said, grabbing his hand and leading the way. This has been an Audible Studios production of Taken by the Alpha, written. Thank you for listening to the Ruthless Alpha. The story of Core's rise to power is just beginning, and there's much more to come. As the pack faces new challenges and betrayals, Core must confront the very nature of his rule and the consequences of his decisions. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on the latest chapters and episodes. What do you think will happen next? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Let's talk about Core's